welcome everyone. This is the first day of the plenary talks for SciCon 2022. We'll have 2 days of plenary talks, and today we're really excited to have so many amazing speakers from different fields. We have speakers from academia, we have speakers from the tech world, and we have speakers from DeSci. So we will kick it off with the first talk by Tushar Jain from Multicoin Capital, talking about token design in the Decentralized Science project. And then we'll have Nicholas after that, founder of LabDAO, talking about LabDAO and let's build an online research organization. Now we have 3 talks by academics, and those are Silvio Peroni from University of Bologna, Giovanni Colavizza from University of Amsterdam, and Ludo Waltman from University of Leiden. And they will give talks about Clearing the Fog of Metascience by Silvio on how to enable reproducible studies through open citations. Giovanni will talk of the advantages of open research data, and Ludo will present publish your reviews. Then we'll have Andre from Fleming Protocol, founder of Fleming Protocol, talking about passion DAOs and how the new driving force, behind biomedical research and translation could be. The last 2 talks will feature another academic speaker, will be Azizi Seixas, talking about how to make research rigorous and inclusive through decentralized research trials. And then we have Iyore closing the day with a talk on Metascience approach to commercializing and building products in decentralized systems. So first of all, I hand it to Jeff to introduce Tushar, our first guest. So thank you very much, Tushar, once again for joining us for this first day of plenary talks at SciCon 2022.
Yeah, awesome. And also want to just make a mention that we'll have POAPs for the attendance for the event too, which we'll send out to the emails of all the people who are going to participate in the event, who have participated in the competition. And we'll also have kind of this the open peer review of a lot of the competition submissions. So that's going to be like publicly peer reviewed for everybody to see, like openly. And that's going to be through the ResearchHub website. So yeah, no, it's my real honor to introduce Tushar. Tushar's the co-founder and managing partner at Multicoin Capital. It's a thesis-driven investment firm that has been really pivotal in helping fund and guide projects across really the entire gamut of the cryptocurrency space. And actually earlier this month, they announced their Venture Fund 3, which is a $430 million fund poised to be invested in crucial areas of Web3 and the crypto economy. So that includes things like data DAOs, Web3 infrastructure, and proof of physical work. So Tushar and his co-founder, Kyle, launched the fund back in, I think, 2017. And as a member of the 2017 crypto cohort myself, it's been really exciting actually to see kind of the massive influence that Tushar and the rest of the Multicoin Capital team has had on like the nascent ecosystem. And they've been with it as it's really kind of gone exponential. And so yeah, without further ado, it's really my great pleasure to invite Tushar up to give his talk discussing what, in my opinion, is like one of the most fundamentally crucial components of any token or any kind of cryptocurrency project, but particularly that in the DeSci space. So he'll be talking about token design.
Thank you, Jeff. I appreciate that introduction. And thanks for having me, everyone. I'm excited to be here today. Really excited about what's happening in DeSci broadly. Excited to learn more about it and invest in the sector as well. I think one of the most important things to talk about, though, is how do we organize these DeSci communities? And to me, tokens are a form of community management and community organization. Really, tokens are an incentivization mechanism, which allows for self-organizing communities around the rules of the token and the protocol and what is incentivized. And this can be enormously powerful. One example of this outside of DeSci that I think is very relevant is just how tokens can lead to a novel way to have capital formation is when you look at things like the Helium network or Hive Mapper, both of which are portfolio companies of ours, where basically you reward people with tokens for doing something that creates a capital asset. So in the case of Helium, you reward people with tokens for putting up wireless routers and providing wireless connectivity. And this creates a capital asset in the form of a global telecommunications network. In the case of HiveMapper, you can incentivize people with tokens to collect always up-to-date mapping data. And this creates a capital asset in the form of an always up-to-date map. With DeSci, what I'm very excited about is the ability to use tokens to incentivize new ways of coordinating in science. For example, being able to reward replication studies, being able to reward peer reviewers, and other parts of the ecosystem that currently are pivotal but don't get rewarded, and building in those incentives in a fair, transparent manner that the entire ecosystem can participate in. I think it's also very important to note that tokens enable permissionless innovation. It means you don't need to go work at some fancy university or have some fancy degree in order to contribute. This is more like the open source software movement, which is anyone can contribute. And I think that that leads to more access, more inclusion of people who may not have the pedigree or the credentials, but may have the ability to contribute to science. Science history is littered with examples of people who came out of nowhere to become some of the most important contributors ever. So let's get into some details here, right? You can use tokens to incentivize specific behaviors, but you have to be very careful how you do this because it's permissionless. Anyone can sign up and start contributing. And if your contribution mechanism is vulnerable to something like a Sybil attack, where someone spins up 10,000 identities or 1 million identities and tries to participate in the protocol, and that is rewarded, that is going to happen. So you need to be very, very careful about how you incentivize these behaviors, how you verify that the behaviors were actually done, and how you reward people. One of the mechanisms that I really like for rewards are to have rewards have a lockup on them, where rewards are not immediately redeemable. I think this dissuades a lot of the hot money kind of people from showing up to the system, because even if they show up, they have to wait 6 months or a year or whatever your lockup is before they're going to make money. This gets to a bigger point here. This is especially true for DeSci, but it's true for other projects as well. You have to be really careful here because you don't want the tail to wag the dog, right? You're creating the tokens in order to further the goals of your project. The biggest failure mode that I see for projects is when they let the tokens and the capital markets take over their original mission. And then their mission changes from what they initially set out to do to satisfying crypto capital markets, or basically looking for a number to go up. And that's a very, very dangerous game because it can be very alluring. All of these projects, it's like going public at like a Series A stage for a startup, right? So you're not necessarily ready as a founder to do that. Most people have not, been public CEOs before. And the pressure that you have on you from investors and from, people out in the community who own the tokens can be incredible. But you have to resist that pressure. You need to engage crypto capital markets, but you cannot let them become the driving force. Examples of this include things like, if you guys have looked at what's happened in the DeFi sector with liquidity mining. So DeFi protocols or decentralized finance protocols tried to incentivize a lot of activity on their protocols by rewarding people with tokens for trading or for lending or for borrowing on those protocols. And what ended up happening is that people just circularly traded with each other or lent and borrowed from themselves in order to create the appearance of massive amounts of activity that were being done by only a handful of people. And the thing is, those people were all acting rationally because the cost to them to do the action was less than the reward that they were getting for doing that action. This also was massively distortive on the actual project leads who looked at their KPIs, going up and to the right and thought that they were doing a great job. They thought everything was working really well because they're seeing their total value locked or trading volume or whatever other KPI they care about go up. And this is one of the most dangerous things in token design is when you let the crypto capital markets price stuff drive activity and then you think that you are succeeding, even though it's actually just a capital markets game. It's one of the first things we look for as investors as well. In more mature projects, this is obviously not relevant for seed stage projects, but this is something that we very explicitly look for. What percentage of activity is organic? And lockups are a very good way to do that. You have to be careful who you reward as well, right? Most of these systems have multiple different types of stakeholders. And not all stakeholders need to be rewarded in the same way. Frequently, what we see are protocols not rewarding stakeholders that need to show up in the case of an emergency. I'll use another DeFi example here, but this is applicable to DeSci protocols as well. In DeFi, when you have a levered position, you have some asset, you've borrowed money against it. Sometimes, you can get a margin call where you need to go post more collateral or you need to pay down your loan. This, if you miss it, means that you get liquidated, right? Your assets are going to get liquidated and someone has to do that on chain. One major failure mode that we've seen is we saw these protocols incentivizing people to borrow, people to lend, people to trade, but they didn't have incentives or strong enough incentives for liquidators in the system. And then if no one shows up to liquidate, that can mean the whole system turns insolvent. So in the case of science, I think that main component right now is replication studies. I think we have a replication crisis in that we are not seeing enough replication studies, and the whole system falls apart without it. Because without the independent verification of what is published, we don't know if it is true. We need to be able to independently verify the methodology, and we need to reward people who do these types of replication studies and who do this type of kind of immune system work for the scientific community. So that's one of the things I'm most excited about in DeSci. That's one of the lowest hanging fruits that I see, is rewarding replication studies and rewarding people for verifying what others have published. Next, I want to talk about financialization. I've talked with, at this point, something like half a dozen to a dozen DeSci entrepreneurs. And one of the concerns that I hear is, I want to launch a token, but I'm worried about overly financializing the community and the interactions within that community. How should I think about this? And I think that's a great question. It is a very valid concern. You do not want to over financialize your protocol. This goes back to the earlier point about letting capital markets drive your KPIs and drive your actions. You need to keep the core mission front and center. But you cannot ignore the capital markets here either. They are critical. That is what is making everything possible. That is where the funding is coming from in order to incentivize everybody. And that is where the coordination mechanism really sits, is in that token that you're using to incentivize people, right? So you have to walk a fine line between overly financializing. These are not strictly capitalistic enterprises, in my opinion. You know, they have a specific goal other than just make as much money as possible, hopefully. But at the same time, you need to make sure that you design the token in a way that it captures value, that investors understand how it will capture value. They will then be willing to fund the research that will then create this value and reward your community contributors. And the communications around this are absolutely critical, because one of the biggest mistakes that I see is people assuming that the investors or the investor community will go through and understand all of the subtle mechanics and nuances in your protocol. Most investors are quite lazy. They're not going to do that. You need to serve it up to them on a silver platter with a one-pager written for a 5-year-old in order to explain, you know, why this is exciting and why they should be willing to invest some of their, you know, hard-earned capital with your project and help fund the research that you're contributing to. So that's a very fine line. Most entrepreneurs have not done this before. So I cannot stress enough the importance of working with good advisors, talking to entrepreneurs who have been through it, working with VC firms, working with other market participants who can help educate you on this type of interaction. I think communications is more important in crypto than it is in other markets, because everything is public, everything is inherently global, and everything is done out in the open. So that means that people can interpret things however they want, and you need to prioritize it, having a clear, consistent message that comes through the noise. This is especially important for capital markets because most investors will not go through to the level of detail needed to draw their own conclusions. You have to serve it up to them. I have a few more things here, and then I want to open it up for questions as well. One of the main things I wanted to talk about is on token design, some do's and don'ts that I have. One don't that I have that I think is critical is don't denominate costs in your protocol in tokens. That is very problematic, because the token price will be volatile. And if it costs me, 10 tokens to do something, and that token is going to swing 50% in price, every week or something, crypto can be quite volatile. That can change the cost to your end user to use your product. And that is a problem. You don't want to say, oh, well, everyone needs to stake 10 tokens. And when I staked, they were worth $1 each. But when Jeffrey has to stake, they're worth $100 each. Well, that's pretty exclusionary. And it doesn't lead to the best outcomes. It strongly suggests always denominating costs in USD or other fiat currency terms in order to make sure that you don't exclude later contributors. One of the easiest things to fall prey to in designing a crypto protocol is overly rewarding the early contributors by giving them way too much of the token supply and way too high rewards. And then this reduces your flexibility in the future to continue to grow the community. You have to be very disciplined about this, because the token supply is a zero-sum game. Yes, you can inflate it later, but capital markets will want to see strong guarantees and understandings around total token supply in order to be willing to buy the token, basically. And so you have to be really careful about not, spending half of your tokens in year one or something like that, because then what ends up happening is those early contributors almost become rent extractors off of the protocol and off the network, because they are going to get a percentage of everything that happens later. This can be very dangerous. I think the best way to build a community in crypto is not to go and have a handful of people make a bunch of money. It's to make a lot of people a small amount of money, such that they're all contributing and excited, but you want to spread the tokens. I believe that every time the crypto industry has found a new way to distribute tokens to value add network participants, that has kicked off a new bull market and kicked off tremendous amounts, billions, tens of billions of dollars in new investment. Examples of this include the proliferation of proof of work mining coins in 2013, to ICOs in 2017, liquidity mining in 2020, NFTs in 2021. Now we're seeing emergence of things like proof of physical work and data DAOs, which Jeff mentioned, which I've published about extensively on our blog, multicoin.capital. But I think DeSci is another one of those that we're very excited about, because if we can reward the scientists and the researchers who are creating the science, I think we can incentivize more of it. And I think that investors will be very excited by the ability to coordinate directly with these people who they previously had to go through institutions in order to be able to contribute to. Right now, for example, for me, I'm a big physics nerd. I would love to be able to contribute to physics research. I don't really have a way to do that easily. I have to go contribute to some organization. There's no easy way for me to contribute to some particular researcher. There's no open funding marketplace for something like that. All right, so I'll wrap this up with just one final point here. I think that science is incredibly important. It's a culmination of all human knowledge here that we're trying to advance. And I think that, honestly, the current system has many major flaws, specifically the stranglehold that journals have on how prestige is perceived within the industry, how some of the incentives drive certain actions like no replication studies, incentivize not publishing when you don't have an exciting result, even though that could be useful information for the future. The only way to contribute to someone else's citations is to go and write your own paper. You can't stake to their paper to say that it's going to be important. You have to go write your own, which is incredibly difficult. And so what I see here is a tremendous amount of opportunity, because at the end of the day, tokens are just an incentivization mechanism. The idea is to use this system, whatever systems that you all are designing, to enable more efficient coordination between these parties all around the world. And if we are able to increase the efficiency of research by 50%, 100%, 200%, which I think are very much on the table, that can really, really change the world. So I'm very excited about the DeSci movement, and excited to be a resource for anyone here, either today with questions, or please feel free to reach out to me independently. My Twitter DMs are open. Very excited to chat and help.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Tushar. And just for everybody, there's a Q&A button. So feel free to ask your questions in the Q&A, and we'll filter through those and read them out. I had a quick one to kickstart all of this off. So you talk about kind of value capture for the token, and this is obviously very important, and different crypto protocols have gone different ways about kind of bringing that value to their token, and some haven't. So you take the Uni token, for example, they haven't done a very good job at capturing any value from the protocol into that token. And so I'm wondering, what are some kind of common mechanisms that you think people in the DeSci movement, or just broadly, can use to, in a like kind of legal way, bring kind of value to the token that they're using?
It's a great question. I think token value capture is critically important, and Uniswap is not able to capture value. That's why they haven't turned on fee capture to Uni token holders. I think that's actually probably negative in the long term. But markets can stay irrational in the short term, for quite some time. So don't look at market prices as like an indicator of rational thinking always. I think there are really two major mechanisms that are used for token value capture today. One is you stake the token in order to earn some fees. It is important that those fees not be denominated in the token that you are staking. So this is not stake SOL in order to earn more SOL. This is more like stake GRT in order to earn the query fees in dollar denominated terms. This means that the token has some cash flow, and therefore you can use a discounted cash flow valuation in order to think about how much it's worth. I actually think this is a very skeuomorphic token design because it looks very much like the old world, where you own a capital asset and you have a stream of income due to owning that capital asset. The pros of this design is that it's very easy for capital markets to understand. The cons are that it introduces a barrier to entry for people to participate in the network, because they have to go acquire some tokens and stake them in order to do something and add value to the network. The model that I like more is called, or at least I call it, the crypto commodity model. We've also published about this one and referred to it as the burn and mint equilibrium model. And the core concepts behind it are, you have token emissions that go to reward certain network participants according to predefined rules. And when someone wants to consume a service provided by your protocol, they must burn a USD denominated amount of tokens. This leads to an equilibrium price, where if I'm issuing 5 million tokens a month, and the token price is $1 right now, that's $5 million of tokens being issued a month. And if there's only market demand to buy $2 million of tokens to consume whatever service my protocol provides, well, now the network is inflating. There are more tokens being issued than burned. And that will cause the price to come down from $1 to, in this case, to 40 cents, where 5 million tokens times 40 cents equals $2 million, which was your dollar denominated demand. And that price will find an equilibrium. The same thing works in reverse, where if you're doing a good job and demand is going up, your protocol is providing a very useful service, you increase the amount of burn. Now it's $10 million being burned, but only 5 million tokens at $1 each being issued. Well, that means that 5 million extra tokens are going to be burned that month. That's deflationary, will push up the price, in this case to a $2 token price, which is where that equilibrium will be between the burning and the minting. I like this model because it does not introduce a barrier to entry for new network participants. I can show up and start doing stuff on your platform without having to contribute capital. So this is much more inclusionary and enables much wider participation.
Yeah, absolutely. It kind of, the buyback burn kind of method, or just the burn method, kind of abstracts away some of like the crypto-esque kind of components of staking and things like that. And so I think especially with a lot of the scientific community who's like less privy to some of the Web3 cryptocurrency side of things, which is what we've kind of been observing, is most of the community isn't so familiar with that. I think abstracting away those concepts are probably kind of the best route. Yeah, is anybody else have any questions? Any questions in the Q&A?
Yeah, I have a question for you, Tushar. So first of all, thank you so much for the talk. That was really amazing, and I really love that you touched upon the reproducibility crisis. That was basically how I got into DeSci, because I was having those problems in the lab. Something that I wanted to ask you is, do you see any specific challenge specific to the DeSci movement? You were talking about communities, winning the community. As the community of scientists, do you see any particular challenge in explaining, token design and so on, and how the platform uses the token to kind of like incentivize the right mechanism, as opposed to, for example, other kind of communities? So anything that is specific to DeSci.
The participants are different, right? Obviously, we're going to have more academics and researchers involved in DeSci protocols, and I think the culture is quite different than the rest of crypto, right? A lot of crypto is, just like a lot of crypto community is honestly there to make money, right? To be very candid. And you have to be careful to segment, who you listen to in your community. I think that's going to be one of the challenges that DeSci projects have, is as DeSci becomes more mainstream, which I expect will happen. We'll see, a DeSci token in the top 50, I hope, within the next 2 years, which I'm quite excited about. That is going to bring in crypto capital markets participants, and you want to take the good and leave the bad, right? You want to take the pros of having all these people who care. You want to educate them. You want to communicate, why this is important. But at the same time, you cannot let them drive the bus. This is also why I'm not the biggest fan of, truly decentralized governance, especially in the early stages of a project. It can seriously derail momentum. I believe that direct democracy is not a good way to make these decisions. If you must have decentralized governance, have something that's more of a Republican form of government where delegates are being elected. And those delegates are being imbued with the authority to make decisions for the protocol to move quickly. One of the best ways to kill a project is to have everything go through committees and have everything go through some long process to go, have the entire community come along. And I know that can be like a natural urge to do it, but it just harms velocity so much. And I think it's a major negative.
Yeah, I also think it could be kind of like overwhelming for the community as well, if you kind of like involve them in every decision. So there should be some kind of like decision on how to go forward with some proposal, and then open that to the community. Again, with like, for example, with token voting, I think it's something that's really useful in this sense to kind of like align the community around the common goal, kind of like a common vision, let's say.
Absolutely.
Okay, so I don't see any other question, so I think we might want to close it here and give the word to the next speaker. So Jeff, any closing thought you have?
No, I just want to thank Tushar greatly for kind of his insight on token design. Again, when DeSci projects are incorporating tokens, it's clearly a central point of their protocol. And so a lot of things are hinged on the token a lot of the times. And so token design is immensely important because everything else kind of gets built on that, or the token is leveraged pivotally to do things. So I think it's very important, and it sets up the protocol for long-term success. So thank you again, Tushar. It was a real pleasure.
Thank you for having me. And if anyone has any questions following up later, please feel free to reach out to me directly. Like I said, really excited about this sector and looking to learn more and invest into this space. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, Tushar.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Timothy actually just posted a post to a article that discusses kind of which decisions should be which types of decisions should be voted on decentralized versus which decisions should be voted on kind of more in a central manner. And so it kind of discusses strategic decisions are best to vote on like in a more decentralized way, and that operational things tend to be better to be done centrally. So the article is called Task Management in Decentralized Autonomous Organizations. So yeah, people definitely check that out in the meantime.
Yeah, I don't know, maybe Timothy, if you want to expand even more a bit, I think we can fill in this minutes. If you want to have a discussion on this, we can kind of open. I mean, we've done, I think on ResearchHub, this is, Jeff, correct me if I'm wrong, the 5th proposal that we sent out to the community. So this is something that we think it's, you know, it's really important to kind of like listen to the community, process what the community wants, and try to decide in an organized way to put forward a proposal that might reflect, you know, some asks that the community might have. And so in doing this, we kind of like organize. We have a little team that organizes and put forward some proposals. And I would say, you know, this has been pretty helpful. We've had some really good feedbacks from the community. When we did these proposals, we always had some good feedbacks in this regard.
Well, I thought that Tushar's presentation was pretty nice, very easily understandable and digestible, and pretty concise. I think a lot of the things that he mentioned kind of aligned with some of our thought processes for tokens as well, like denominating the price of like the activities on the website or the platform in like a dollar peg rather than a fixed token amount. And I think also like not overly rewarding early contributors, because you need to maintain like a consistent pace over the lifetime of the protocol to be able to reward people who come in and entrants down the road as well. So yeah, it was very exciting to see some of those topics brought up.
The thing that I was thinking is, it was talking about not denominating things, you know, activity that happens on the platform with a specific token. But something I was thinking is also that might be pretty, on the long term, kind of like overwhelming to see. Let's say you use a token for your platform and you want to use, let's say, a USD equivalent. Unless you want to just show the USD equivalent on the website, if you want to show your token, that value, like people would not have, you know, kind of like the perception of what it takes to use like this token for a specific activity, because that value will be continuously fluctuating. Also in terms of like backend work, I think that would be some, you know, that would probably cause some troubles as well. So what I was thinking is, in this case, if you really don't want to denominate in the token that you're using, the activity that's happening on the website, you will then have to just, you know, use USD, and then let's say your token will be a little bit more hidden from the community itself, because they will not see that. They will just think about the USD equivalent. That might also be something that, you know, doesn't really hurt, but it will be a different experience from what it is probably now with most of the protocols.
Okay, well then yeah, I mean, it's a very short intro. I'm very happy, first of all, and thankful for the organization of the SciCon and invitations. I'm very glad that we are trying to, you know, start making a connection between the ResearchHub community and the DeSci movement more in general, and the Metascience community, who is tonight, I think, quite well represented by Silvio and Ludo, and quite less well represented by myself. So let's start with Silvio's presentation. So as a means of introduction, Silvio is a professor of computer science in Bologna in Italy, and he's also the director of the Open Citations, which is, in my opinion, a very useful and very important project that I think he will speak about in his presentation. And the title of Silvio's intervention is Clearing the Fog on Metascience, or How to Enable Reproducible Studies Through Open Citations. Thank you, Silvio.
Okay. Thank you, Giovanni, for the introduction. I would like just to share. Okay, Giovanni has already introduced myself, so I won't spend seconds, let's say, overdoing the whole thing. So, as you can imagine from the title, my presentation will be about reproducibility, of course. And with reproducibility, what I mean is basically the possibility of reproduce exactly the same results of an experiment, starting from same data and using the same methods or algorithms that have been used in the original study for reaching such results. Of course, this is a kind of desirable thing for any study in science, at least. But a kind of recent, let's say, study run by Monia Baker a few years ago, who involved a lot of more than 1,000 scientists in answering a very precise questionnaire on this topic of reproducibility, have said basically that the 70% of the scientists that who participated in the questionnaire failed in reproducing an experiment done by another scientist, and more than half of them actually failed to reproduce their own experiment. And this to me is a kind of very good measure in order to understand how much this desirable thing of science actually is a big issue within the scholarly ecosystem. Of course, the reproducibility as an issue affect a lot of different disciplines to a different level, honestly. But of course, also a specific discipline I care about a lot, that is scientometrics in general, but also science of science studies, let's say, are affected by reproducibility. And in a wonderful paper, several scientists, including Ludo, who is presenting today as well, have highlighted what are the main, let's say, threads that are there and that basically are a problem when we would like to try to make a study in scientometrics in particular reproducible. So they identify basically 4 different dimensions: data, software tools, methods, and results. With data, the main issue is that a lot of bibliomedical data that have been used in studies, published studies, I mean, are not freely accessible. So first of all, problem of accessibility of the data. Then that data that are large scale, that are actually the usual dimension of data that you need for running this kind of studies, are very expensive. So you have to pay a big fee in order to access this data. And a last issue about data is that there is a kind of lack of a systematic approach to version control. So data, in principle, data are modified because they are improved, more or less, depending, or error are introduced in some cases. So are modified in time, but there is no systematic mechanism for keeping track of this evolution in time of the data. In addition to the problem related to the data, there is also a problem related to the software, that often the software that is used for running an analysis is not made available by the authors of the study, or it is a commercial software, so one has to pay in order to reuse exactly the software for the same analysis, or in some other cases, the software is free available, but it is not open source, which is a huge issue when we want to check that actually the method, so the algorithmic technique used for running the analysis, is free of mistake. And this, of course, is not the only aspect related to methodology that is problematic, but also if methods themselves in the article are not described with a sufficient detail, we can have issues in reproducibility. And finally, the fact that often the results are presented at the aggregate level, but it will be very useful to have a more detailed view on this data produced by analyzing a specific set of input data. And also, it would be very important to make these results available in the long term by putting them in repository that are sustained in the long term. So these are the specific issues, threats to reproducibility, actually, that are, let's say, part of these, at least of these disciplines, not only this discipline, honestly. Of course, this issue in not having reproducibility implemented in these specific kind of studies also affect another important thing, which is very, very well known within the scholarly community and the academic ecosystem, which is also related with research assessment exercises. A lot of very important institutions and entities in general have provided in the past a lot of documents explaining what we need, what is desirable in order to have a fair and transparent assessment of research. For instance, in the National Plan for Open Science of the French government say that all the assessment systems should reflect the principles and practices of open science. We have also the Dollar Declaration that say that the data must be open and transparent, both data and methods actually, in particular those ones that are used for calculating metrics that then can be used for assess research, people, institutions, and also that this data should be available without any constraint and should be provided by means of programmatic access made by REST API or computational access in general. The Leiden Manifesto as well say that anyone should be able to verify the data and the analysis that have been done, and that the data collection that is performed and the analysis that is implemented for evaluating himself or herself should be open, transparent, and simple. And last but not least, a recent report by the European Union that say that, of course, it is crucial to have independence and transparency of the data for doing this kind of assessment, but also this can be possible only by ensuring the control and ownership by the research community itself of the critical infrastructure and tools that are used for the assessment. So these are some of the aspects related to the reproducibility that, of course, if everything is totally reproducible, will be addressed without any problem. But actually, the situation we know is something that is a kind of evolving in this last year. And I would like just to introduce very briefly our own contribution that we are trying to do exactly to making these exercises, but also in general research on that use bibliographic and citation data reproducible. And by doing that, basically we have tried to work for building an infrastructure which we launched in 2016 that actually is derived from a project that was approved more than 12 years ago, run by David Shatton at the University of Oxford. The infrastructure that I would like to introduce to you is named Open Citations. It is an independent global not-for-profit infrastructure organization which is entirely dedicated to open scholarship, and in particular the goal is to publish open bibliographic metadata and citation data about academic publications. What we want to do with the infrastructure itself is to provide all this data, but not only the data, but also the services for accessing the data and the software developed for creating these services open and free. So anyone can reuse everything, basically, without paying any fee, basically. And also, we believe in the involvement of the community in the governance of the infrastructure itself. Indeed, the International Advisory Board, which is the main board providing guidance for the infrastructure, is made by several actors of several different entities within the scholarly community. It is an infrastructure that is entirely supported by the effort of the community, financially supported, but also supported in a sense that working together with other institutions to provide better data, better services, and better software. And among the data that we provide, the main collection that we have so far is what we call open citation indexes that contains this open citations index of Crossref open DOI to DOI citations, or COCI, that currently contains more than 1.3 billion citation links between different scholarly publications. And these citations, that are data, if you want, can be accessed in different ways. Programmatically, by means of the classic web REST API, you can retrieve this data in CSV and JSON. So data, I mean citations related to a certain entity defined by a DOI, so a persistent identifier for publications. We have also a Sparkle endpoint that allow you to use semantic web technologies, in particular Sparkle, which is a query language for RDF data, for doing very sophisticated query on the data. And also all the data that we produce are available in different formats as dumps. So you can download the entire data set containing all the citations that we have and that we, let's say, make available by using this REST API and Sparkle endpoint. In addition, a specific aspect that we really care about is that about provenance and change tracking. So we want to know, basically speaking, what were the source data that have been used in order to create a specific entity within our system. And the approach that we use for keeping track of the evolution of these entities in time is based on snapshot, where snapshot is basically a descriptive status of a certain entity at a given time. So when we create for the very first time an entity within our system, we create the first snapshot that is accompanied by provenance information. That means who have created the data, when the data have been created, and which was the primary source that have been used for getting the raw data for creating our specific entity in our system. And this approach is basically repeated every time we need to modify the data of that entity for a specific reason, because maybe there are mistakes and we want to correct them, or we want to add additional data compared to the previous one to the entity itself. And every time we make a modification of an entity, we create a new snapshot of an entity with provenance information. And this is exactly the approach that we are adopting for version control of the data related to a specific entity. And these data are made available with machine readable formats, actually semantic web formats, linked data formats that include not only the data of the entity itself, but also provenance information, as I anticipated before, with source, the kind of, let's say, data that have been added and deleted to an entity according to the specific snapshot we are in a specific given time, and the date and the agents involved in such a modification or operation in general. Now, very briefly, last two slides, and then I stop. This is just a short list, if you want, of some of the existing and published studies that have decided to use open citations data for some purpose related to the research they are presenting. Usually, actually, open citation data are advertised within these studies as a means for rich reproducibility of at least one aspect of the research, because often these studies try to combine data that are coming from different services and different sources. And of course, not all the services provide fully open data, but for what concerns open citation, of course, you can reuse the data for any purpose. We publish the data by using a CC0 waiver. That basically means that there are no constraints in reusing the data at all. You can reuse really for any purpose. And these are just a selection of some of the papers that are reusing open citation data for research purposes. This is just for research. There is also self-citation there, the full disclosure. So an article that I have co-authored with Giovanni, by the way, where we used data of open citations for analyzing a specific aspect, a specific discipline. And finally, as a last slide, one of the most challenging and actually rewarding part of our job in running this infrastructure, honestly, is the, let's say, the involvement that we have with the broader community, open science community out there. Open citation is an open science infrastructure, of course, that have been selected by the Global Sustainability Coalition for Open Science Services a few years ago as one of the infrastructures that deserve to be supported by the community in order to guarantee its long-term sustainability and viability, of course. And the reason why we have been selected were basically that SCOS thought that we align very well with Open Science goal, and we offer an innovative service that can be a game changer by challenging established proprietary citation services. From that specific year, actually, we started a lot of different collaboration with several infrastructures, open science infrastructure around the world and projects. We are working actively with OpenAir, for instance, for providing services related to citations, of course, in their graph, and also with other infrastructure and projects like Outside Bison, Optimate, Rises, PKP, DOAB, and OEPN. We have active collaboration with these projects and entities in order to basically try to build a better scholarly communication world that is free, open to any researcher, independently from the specific, let's say, affiliation the researcher is working in. So all the services that we offer are free, are open, anyone can use it. Of course, we have support, financial support from the community, and that is the reason why we are still there, providing better services, providing new services that anyone can use for any purpose. And that was my last slide. So thank you very much for your time. And if there are any questions, I'm just here.
Thank you, Silvio. Thank you so much for this presentation. I think this will be of extreme interest for attendees and people in the DeSci community as an exemplar infrastructure in support of open science. I'm asking people to please type should I have questions, but also remind that I don't think we have much time actually, given the schedule. But in the meanwhile, I do have one question. I mean, I have several questions, but I think one is perhaps very fitting to this setting, which is about sustainable support, financial support, and then long-term sustainability for this kind of projects, right? Because I know this has been a big, of course, challenge for you as director of the project, and is always a little bit of concern, right, for this kind of endeavors. So my question is, what you would have liked to have when you started this project, as a a way to finance it, to support it, and what you think would be ideal to have in order to make it long-term sustainable?
Okay, so what I wanted to have at the very beginning, honestly, so everything started with grants. So we applied for grants to foundation. The very first foundation that supported us was Sloan, but also Wellcome provided us financial support for starting, basically. That wasn't enough for sustain the infrastructure, of course, but it's a starting point. So let's say a reasonable grant for prototyping the infrastructure was exactly what we had and what we needed at that time. When we moved basically to the next level, so when we started to this SCOS involvement in the infrastructure, the very, very first difficult thing we had was to have appropriate people to handle all the possible stuff related to managing an infrastructure. So at the very beginning, we were David, Shatton, and I, two people, and we handle everything. David Shatton from, let's say, an organizational point of view, myself from a technical point of view, but we were just two people. So what was very difficult at the beginning, that when we entered in SCOS, there were some requirements for being involved in SCOS, and the first requirement was to setting up a kind of organizational infrastructure that was legally sound and that enabled the involvement of the community, the possibility of receiving donation, of receiving membership. So we have to set up a membership program. All these kind of stuff are totally far from my expertise. So we spent, honestly, the first months in trying to understand how to do it. Also, thanks to the help of my university that was involved, we were able to do that. And thanks to the first donations and money that we received, we were also able to hire people that are now responsible to following these practices that I really don't know. They are not part of my expertise. In the long term, I mean, these let's say SCOS was very good because it allowed us to build up a community of supporters. And in principle, that is a good way for basically create a platform of sustainability of the current status of the infrastructure in the long term. It's up to us right now to be good in maintaining and also expanding this community of supporters in order to get enough money basically to support the infrastructure year by year. So it's something that we are building. That is a good approach. Of course, that approach is good for maintaining the infrastructure as it is, but so far for adding a plus X of the services or the data that we would like to have, the only feasible way is to try to apply for additional grants for a specific.
For the grants. Yeah, understood. So I think the transition points, right? If I understood you correctly, are particularly challenging, right? So say from a prototype to first version of a product or a minimum viable product. That's really different scale and a different staffing that is required. So I think that might be something to keep in mind also for the DeSci community. Great, thank you, Silvio. So I'm looking at Ricardo now, just to understand whether there is time for another question or we should move on.
Yeah, so your slot starts at 7:10. So I think there's still 5 minutes if you want to get into more questions. Otherwise, as you know, feel free to get flexible as you wish.
Yeah. Okay. So I don't see questions in the Q&A, but Silvio, if you don't mind, I do have a quick one. I mean, it's not an easy one, but I'll keep it quick. So another interesting point, I think, for the DeSci community is our incentives, right? And it's incentive design. And one thing that is important when we want to reproduce research, even more when we want to replicate research, I mean, that's a whole different bar, is to provide incentives to researchers to do so, right? And we know that this is perhaps not optimal at the moment in terms of the credit that you get when you replicate or reproduce a study, particularly when you reproduce one. So I was wondering whether you have thoughts about incentives, potentially even new ones, or means to really foster that as a practice, as a more systematic practice in the community. And give an example that I think struck me as being very successful, but I think it's relatively small scale still. At the University of Amsterdam, colleagues have embedded the replication of results of machine learning papers in a course, a pretty advanced master level course in machine learning, right? So that they have essentially groups of students that every year they do a reproducibility challenge. And basically it has become quite like a shared task of sorts as part of their degree. I think this is very nice. I mean, it's very educational as well as an experience. So I wonder if you have thoughts in that direction that we could, that DeSci community could perhaps consider in picking up.
I mean, there are, I would say, well, replicability is something that strongly depends on the field that you are considering, because each single discipline has clearly different kind of issues that are there for trying to make a study replicable or reproducible in general. And so each discipline should approach the problem according to their own point of view. So there is no one single solution that fits all, in my opinion. This is the first thing. Honestly, yes, teaching to let's say to students would be very, very, very good in general as a way to start to even make them more sensitive to the problem. They are the researcher of tomorrow. So if they know that there is an issue there, but honestly, then we need to also to address it to all the people that are doing research now that maybe don't care about it, because there is this practice that often is one of the main issue. I think the main issue that only papers count basically, and the more I have, the better I am, and that is affects strongly the assessment exercise around the world. So I will be evaluated for my classic publications. That's the point. And because of that, since I want to spend the minimal time available for publishing the more paper I can, I usually don't spend time in making my data in a way that are reproducible, making my data in a way that can be easily reused by others, making my software available, citing my software appropriately, putting all the information that are needed there for making the experiment basically reproducible. So the point here is that at a political level, and that is something that at least in Europe is starting to happen, I will say, we need a strong political commitment here that change the assessment exercise in order to provide kind of rewards to these practices that are crucial for science. So I need to be rewarded also for my data. I need to be rewarded also for making my process, my work more understandable by other users. That is exactly what I think should happen in order to have it implemented in the system, not only teaching, but also, you know, at the political level.
Yeah, totally. Couldn't agree more. Yes, indeed. I see a question from Patrick in the chat. I don't know, Silvio, whether you have access to the Q&A box.
Yeah, I can see it. Non-academic background. I mean, we are dealing with data that actually belongs, basically speaking, to the academic background, so to culture, if you want. So we have a bunch of players that understand the importance of this data from a higher level perspective, not simply the scholarly community, but let's say at a policy level. So, for instance, one of the bigger supporters that we have is the French ministry, which is actually related to me also to the academic background, because I mean, it's Ministry of Education, Science there. So it's something that relates to that specific aspect, but it is from a higher, let's say, layer, in my opinion. So the other, the question was, I'm just seeing it. Yeah, I thought that all the people can read it, but the question was if we have among the supporters also, let's say, institutions or entities that are not strictly academic. That was the main thing. So mainly they are academics. We have academic libraries, we have university, we have research centers. Among the adopters of the services that we offer, there are even companies that actually works within the academic ecosystem. So that needs this data for producing new services, offering new services to their users and these kind of things. But the main group of interested parties, let's say, are kind of around the academia, I would say.
Yeah. All right. Okay. I think I can let you go, Silvio. But thank you so much, really, for joining us and for presenting open citations, also as within the context of reproducibility. I think this will be very much of interest to the Sci community. And
thank you for
also
inviting
thank you
me.
in particular for joining us over a weekend. So much appreciated. All right, great. Ricardo?
Thank you, Silvio. Thank you, Silvio. That was really great. Thank you for joining.
Thank you, Ricardo.
All right, good. So my name is Giovanni. I'm also an academic. I do sometimes I do work in Metascience work, let's say, also with Silvio and Ludo. Ludo will speak later on. And I'm based at the University of Amsterdam, and I'm also helping a little bit with the Research Hub as one of the editors for the Metascience Hub, actually. So if you're curious about that, I try to put interesting papers in there from time to time. And I'm going to tell you something about the advantages of open research data. Now, the topic is open research data, right? It's actually very fitting that Silvio just presented, because he really very well gave you the context of open research data as part of the broader effort within open science. And in a nutshell, why do we want to have research data openly available? So primarily because this allows for reproducibility of research results. I'm really following Silvio's definition here. So using the same data, the same code, exactly the same experimental design in order to check whether the results are exactly as reported in a paper. And for reusing the data, right? So different users expanding upon it, or what have you. So giving new life to this data. So reproducibility and reuse. As Silvio also mentioned, open research data is really part of the agenda, in particular of funding organizations and the open science network more broadly. I'm mentioning here, with a very European biased perspective, a few initiatives. For example, in the funding ecosystem, as researchers, we are increasingly asked to publish our data openly, and infrastructure initiatives such as Zenodo or OpenAir are popping up to support researchers in doing so. Again, this is very European, but I hope you can think about similar initiatives in countries where you are based. So point being that open research data is a big topic and an important one. Now, how is it that we make our data open? And in particular, how is it that we connect it with the paper that we actually publish? The way we mostly do it is through an extension, if you like, of the PDF format, right? So we all know that we are running by the PDF format in research with its limitations. And the primary way to add reference to the data supporting a paper is through what are called data availability statements. And you see an example here, right? So it's a paper of mine that I will be talking about in a moment. And here what we did is really to add short sentence, code and data can be found at, and then there is a DOI and so permanent identifier, and a link to a repository where everything is stored and documented. So a data availability statement is, a PDF technology that tells the reader of an article where the data supporting the results are and where they can be found for further use. Now, what I want to talk about here are 2 points. One is, can we actually make a somewhat selfish reason to publish research data? Right? So we know that there is a push towards it. We know that transparency is good for the reasons that Silvio and myself mentioned, and therefore it's a good thing, right? But we also know that the point about incentives is still a little bit lacking, right? And publishing research data is actually an effort, right? Because you need to document it, you need to clean it up, you need to make it available, so it exposes you in some way, which is good, but also requires increased effort. So can we, is there a selfish reason to publish research data? And I think we found one which might be interesting to researchers. And the second thing is, what is actually missing in publishing research data in terms of ecosystem and in particular infrastructure and good practices, where I think the DSci community could really help. So starting from the first point, selfish case for providing data. In a paper a couple of years ago, myself and colleagues, we asked the following question, right? So do we have a change in citations, in particular received citations that a paper gets over time after publication, if the data is also shared, right? So if an author or authors follow the good practice of publishing research data, do they get extra credit in terms of more citations that they receive? And if the answer is positive, then we can say that there is a kind of selfish case for data availability, because indeed received citation is an important metric for research evaluation. So what we did was to collect data, over 500,000 articles from 2 publishers, PLOS and BMC, Biomed Central, and to develop a pipeline in order to extract data availability statements and classify them in the following 4 categories. The categories go from 0 to 3, and they are, let's say, they are from not so good to very good in terms of open science good practices. So category 0, not so good, is the data is not available, right? I mean, there might be some good reasons for the data being not available. For example, a paper is not supported by any data analysis, so that's fine. Then we have category 1, which is data is available upon request. This is really not good, right? Because there are very many studies that have found that in this situation, very often the data is actually not available, and maybe the authors, they don't reply, or they don't provide sufficient amount of data to reproduce the results of the paper and whatever. Third option, not so bad, actually quite good. The data is available with the paper or supplementary files. Best is the data is available separately in a repository. Why this is best? Because a repository usually improves the accessibility, fungibility, and long-term storage of the data. I'll mention this in more detail later on. So we have these 4 categories. And then what we did was to, first of all, take a look at the development over time or usage over time of data availability statements. And we found that for both publishers, actually, the transition really happened when the publisher decided to mandate, right? So to really compel the authors to add a data availability statement in their articles. Before that, you see that transition point for the 2 publishers, so BMC on the left and PLOS on the right, with a thick black line in the 2 plots. And the plots are showing you the number of papers essentially over time in different colors according to whether they have a data availability statements or and the different categories. So there is a big transition when a mandate kicks in. What is more, there is a big difference even at the publisher level, so very coarse aggregation level, in terms of actually which kind of data availability statement category authors use. For example, in BMC, they use much more upon request. In PLOS, they use much more in the paper or in a repository. But key point here is that mandating seems to be kind of essential to have compliance. What is more, and likely the main finding of the paper, is that the question that I posed at the beginning is actually confirmed. So we run a regression analysis, so it's purely observational and correlational study, right? So it's really scratching the surface, but it points to a quite strong effect that papers have when they do have a data availability statement of category 3, actually. So when they do have data made openly available in an external repository. So when this happened, we were able to find an up to quarter more citations on average that are received after 3 years from publication, which is quite non-significant. I mean, it's pretty significant incentive, let's say, or selfish motivation to work on publishing data, and in particular in an external repository, so publishing it properly. Now, I won't spend much time on trying to speculate why this might be the case, right? Because again, with this experimental design or observational study, we cannot really say much about it. But to say that there might be at least two big reasons that influence this effect or this trend. One is that let's say that publishing data openly like this requires resources, so it's time consuming, and it might be the case that this is something that on average only the laboratories or the researchers that are better funded do more systematically. And we know that researchers that are better funded, they tend to have also received more citations, right? Because it's a self-reinforcing mechanism. On the other hand, though, hopefully this is also in part at least explained by positive impact of following open science practice, right? Because publishing data openly indeed allows for reproducibility and data reuse, which intuitively makes sense that it would foster citations to a certain paper, right? Because people can more easily build upon it. Be that it may, there is also a selfish case for publishing data openly and also properly, I'd say, so in an external repository. But this is also something that researchers it seems to be the case, had to be pushed and have to be pushed, like not all of them, but most of them, to do so. Nevertheless, also I think quite some not so glorious news. For example, there's only a relatively small, I think, fraction of publications in this specific study actually had a data availability statement of category 3, right? So 20% for PLOS and 12% for BMC. Again, there might be good reasons for this, right? So in particular, if you have data BMC, this is often the case from trials involving humans. It's often not really the case that you can publish it openly. But on the other hand, it also signals that still there is a way to go in terms of open publication of data being a more normal practice, I would say. But there is more to, I think, the negative news. In a recent and I think very, very interesting report that I encourage people in DeSci to take a look at on scholarly communication during COVID, and in particular the response of the scholarly communication system to COVID. A group of researchers, including Ludo, that is going to speak after me, try to provide really a systematic overview of how the scholarly communication system reacted to COVID. And these kind of external shocks, they are, they're very bad, but in a sense they are good because they allow Metascience people to actually study what is working and what is not working. And a lot of things are not working, as we know in science. In particular, it seems to be the case that for COVID, despite a strong push to publish openly, data was not really made openly available and not really systematically so, which is really a pity. Might be in part explained by the need to move really fast, but on the other hand, it's not really good because there was strong incentive to do so. In the same report, the authors suggest have a few recommendations for everyone involved in science, in the science ecosystem, in order to do a better job at publishing data. And I think these are also very good point for the DeSci community when they design applications and new infrastructure. So in particular, again, adding data availability statements and really adding incentives for authors to do so. Following the FAIR guidelines, so making data findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable through metadata and using shared standards, and making data policies registered, very clearly, openly available, so that people can easily follow them. In conclusion, though, I also think that making research data openly available, and in particular reaching this goal of systematic reproducibility of research results, requires something more than just the data. And I actually think it requires two things. One, it's a, let's say, computational full stack that is composed of good practices. So, for example, fair practices, artifacts, not just data, but also code and any relevant configuration, and a virtual environment that people can use in order to really reproduce results and play with the data. So for those familiar with machine learning, for example, Radio is a good example, right? So it's an online platform that allows to very easily make research result reproducible. This is one component. And the second component are incentives. As I was discussing with Silvio, we really need to, to give good reasons to researchers to do this effort, to make this effort. Good intentions are not enough, unfortunately. So this is something that I also think the Sci community can play a significant role, in particular, given its propensity for rapid and creative experimentation. I also put at the bottom there a couple of examples that I think are related, one from academia, the other one from DSci. So one is the Turing Way handbook, and the other one is the Ocean Protocol, that go really in this direction, and they do so, in my opinion, very well. So I encourage you to take a look if you're interested. And with that, I thank you so much, and I'm happy to take any question you might have.
Thank you, Giovanni. That was a really great talk. And I actually have a question for you from the audience. Ludo just asked you, Giovanni, do you also know to what extent published data is actually being reused by other researchers? The fact that researchers cite an article that makes his data openly available doesn't necessarily mean that the citing researchers are reusing the data. It would be great to have an evidence of actual reuse. Do you know whether such evidence exists at the moment?
Yeah, Ludo, thank you for the question. I think this is a great question, and it's kind of funny because I was trying, preparing even this presentation. I was trying to find kind of status of open research data paper, giving a kind of overview of how much, how many data is there, how much it is reused, what it is used for, and I couldn't find it. Could find only studies that are specific to different communities and the like, so I don't have a general answer. There might be something that I've missed, of course, but I don't have a general answer. I think this study is very much needed. So maybe we should discuss offline and do this study, actually. I suspect, though, that the answer to your specific question is going to change a lot according to the community. I see from, let's say, anecdotally at least, that in certain communities, practice of reusing data is much more systematically embedded in the research practice, thinking about machine learning community, for example. Whilst I think in other communities, much less so, right? Because there is less incentive to reuse the data, and there is much more incentive to do something new or completely new, right? So I wouldn't be surprised that if this were to be very different across communities. So I don't know much more about this. I mean, there are specific studies, of course, for different communities, but not overall big picture. So that sounds like a great topic for collaboration in the future. Or whoever wants to do it, feel free to ping us. I think we would be interested. Ludo, good to see you. Thanks a lot for joining us tonight. So Ludo is well, I mean, it's key player, I think, in Metascience and science studies more broadly. Very happy that he has joined us today. Ludo is a professor of quantitative science studies at the Center for Science and Technology Studies, Leiden University. Really do encourage you, if you don't know the center and Ludo's work, to take a look. There is a lot going on at the center more broadly. It's really nice place. And I also encourage you to follow Ludo on Twitter, because he's a great way to be in touch with all that is happening in the Metascience space. So I think it's it's really one of those good persons to follow on Twitter. And Ludo is going to tell us about a recently launched, also very important initiative, Publish Your Reviews, and Grassroots initiative to improve scientific publishing. Ludo, thank you again.
Thank you, Giovanni, for a very nice introduction. Yes, I would like to share with all of you some information about the Publish Your Reviews initiative, initiative of which I'm one of the organizers, and an initiative that was launched just a few weeks ago. And I have a very specific aim today, because I actually would like to convince you all to support this initiative. And that's one aim I have, and the other aim I have today is to perhaps also learn a bit more from the Decentralized Science community, how an initiative like this one can be kind of strengthened in terms of how we think about, again, incentivizing researchers to actually change their way of working. So I realize I'm not the first one today to raise that issue, but also for this initiative, it is quite crucial. So I should start by explaining what this is all about. So this is an initiative that is that was launched a few weeks ago by ASAP Bio. ASAP Bio is an organization that is promoting innovation in scientific publishing, in particular in the life sciences. And I'm one of the organizers, together with the team of ASAP Bio, of this initiative. So we have a website, publishyourreviews.org, and there you can, of course, find all the information. It started about 1 year ago. So 1 year ago, I wrote this blog post, and I wrote that blog post because I was rather frustrated. I started to realize that I do quite a lot of peer review of articles submitted to scientific journals. That's not because I'm in some way special. All researchers, basically, especially when you reach a certain level of seniority, we all do a lot of this peer review. It takes a lot of time. It's typically time outside regular office hours. In the evenings, in the weekends, we do all this peer review work. And I was frustrated, not because of all the hours I spend doing this. That's perfectly fine. I believe this is important, and I'm happy to do it. But I was frustrated because I was in doubt whether all this time that I spent is really time that is well spent, time that is spent in a useful way. And to be honest, I started to have more and more doubts about that. What's the problem? And this is just a quote from my own blog post. Typically, what we do when we do peer review, we make an evaluation of an article. That evaluation is shared with the authors and with an editor of a journal. So it's typically just a few people that will hopefully benefit from that review. Just a few people. And that, I think, is a big problem. So researchers that do peer review invest a lot of time in this. They put a lot of effort to go into the details of an article, to think about the arguments that authors make and whether these arguments really make sense, perhaps even to look at the code, the data, perhaps to even try to reproduce some of the findings. It's a lot of time investment, and just a few people benefit from this. And in particular, who doesn't benefit is the actual readers of the article. Well, they may, of course, indirectly benefit. So if the authors find your review useful and start to improve their article, then ultimately also the readers will benefit. But the readers do not immediately benefit. And what I mean by that is the following. Many articles are already available online nowadays. When they are under peer review, they are online on preprint servers. So they are already being read by people. Because more and more researchers, they just read the preprints and they don't wait many months or even years before finally the article appears in a journal. But these readers of the preprints, they cannot make use of this valuable information that can be found in reviews, because these reviews are not public. And that's, in my view, a huge waste of effort. And that's a problem. That's so much time, so much valuable time that is not used in a kind of effective way. And that's the problem I want to solve. And that's what Publish Your Reviews is about. So what I started to do, and that's also what I announced 1 year ago, I started to publish my reviews. So I do all this peer review like I've always been doing it. But now when I do this review, I do not only send my review to an editor of a journal. I still do that, but in addition, I also publish the review online. I link it to the preprint version of the article, and I hope that in addition to the authors and the editors, also the readers will benefit. So I'm not the only one who was frustrated. So this is 20 years ago. So that's really important. 20 years ago, Fiona Godley, she's well known as the previous editor-in-chief of the British Medical Journal. 20 years ago, she already kind of wrote about these topics. She said what we need is preprint servers combined with open commentary. So that needs to replace the current flawed system of closed pre-publication peer review and its false reassurances about reliability of what is published. So this whole idea that two reviewers behind closed doors can kind of decide in a reliable way whether a particular study is sound or not, that doesn't make sense. And that's what Fiona Godley emphasized 20 years ago. I think it's something that many journal editors also know and many researchers, but we do not always like to acknowledge this because it's a bit of a painful conclusion. She made this argument 20 years ago. We need to do all of these things openly, and we need preprint servers, we need open review processes. And essentially the Publish Your Reviews initiative is now trying to move the community in that direction. So we are not the only ones who are pushing for this. So there are lots of other organizations. I don't have time to mention them all, but that are also working on this. Organizations that create infrastructures, journals that promote preprinting. Many things are going on. So we see growth in preprinting, especially in recent years. So you see how this has increased. We see growth in journals that publish the review reports for accepted articles. Again, really big growth in recent years. And also growth in peer review, not for journals, but for preprint. So there's new ways of doing peer review outside the journal system. So that's potentially really a completely new way of thinking about how publishing can be done. But all of these things are growing. And these statistics are incomplete in all kinds of ways, but the main conclusion is it's all growing. And that conclusion is a solid conclusion despite the limitations of these statistics. So this is happening. This is great, this is important, but despite the huge growth, this is still only about a tiny share of all the research outputs that are pre-printed, that have publicly available reviews. So yes, a lot is happening, but it's still at a small scale. And Publish Your Reviews wants to scale this up. So this is the old-fashioned way of doing things. Researchers submit an article to a journal, the journal organizes closed peer review, and then at some point it decides whether to publish the article, acceptance or rejection, so not to publish the article. And articles that are rejected are typically then submitted to a different journal because authors want to publish their articles somewhere. So I mentioned that there's more and more pre-printing, so articles are actually already published prior to submission to a journal, increasingly often, fortunately, but not always. And at the end of the process, we see now also that increasingly journals start to publish the peer review reports for the accepted articles. But as I mentioned, it's a small share of all the articles for which this is happening. So Publish Your Reviews is an initiative that is in a very pragmatic way trying to change the system. So this is not a kind of a proposal for a radically different system. I have ideas about how this whole thing could be done in a radically different way. But that's difficult, of course, because it's kind of just very difficult to make people at a large scale change their behavior. So Publish Your Reviews is pragmatic. It just tries to convince researchers to change their behavior in a very, very kind of small, minor way. And that could, we argue, make a really big difference. What we ask reviewers to do is the following. When you do peer review in the traditional way for a journal, consider to publish your reviews online, to link them to the preprint version of the article. And that is, as I already mentioned, helpful for the readers of the preprint. And all the concerns that people often have about preprints not being reliable can also be partly addressed by this. It also helps journal editors, because journal editors, when they receive a submission, they can actually look online to see if there are already reviews publicly available, and they can reuse those reviews. And this is also a major benefit because the peer review system is under a huge pressure, and it's extremely difficult for journal editors to find peer reviewers because there are too many articles that need to be peer reviewed and there are not enough qualified reviewers. So we need to make the system more efficient, and by publishing the reviews, it's not only the readers that benefit, it's also the journal editors that benefit from this. So that's the idea. This is the website of our initiative, Publish Your Reviews. So here we explain the whole thing in more detail, and we explain all the reasons why this is a good thing and why this is important. The argument of providing context around published research and helping readers of preprints to better understand and better appreciate the research. That's an argument that we also make in this blog post, where we, for instance, argue that if we really want to move away from things like impact factors, which many people consider to be one of the big problems in the way publishing is done, but also in the way assessment in science is done. If we want to move away from that, we need alternative ways of providing information about the value of published research. And peer reviews is one way in which that can be done, publishing peer reviews. So we convinced quite a few publishers to support this initiative, publishers and journals, and also lots of other organizations, preprint servers, peer review platforms, research funders, organizations that are pushing for change in assessment practices. They all support this initiative. So for instance, some of you may know about this so-called Plan S, which is a plan for changing the publishing system, supported by lots of important research funders. They are also in support of this initiative that we launched a few weeks ago. And partly they expressed this in this statement that they published. We have ambassadors that are supporting this initiative, and that goes from early career researchers, PhD students, for instance, that feel that this is important, to professors, and even to, for instance, someone like Randy Shachman, who is, as you may know, a Nobel laureate. He's also, he has strong ideas about this, and he also really feels this is the direction in which we need to move. So he's also one of our ambassadors. Silvio is here as well as one of our ambassadors. So it's a quite diverse group of people that all feel that this is important. And I would like to invite you all to also support this initiative. So you can do that by simply signing our pledge. And the pledge is as follows. When a journal invites me to review an article that is available as a preprint, I will publish my review alongside the preprint. That's the essence of the pledge. And then there's one more sentence which just states that you will make sure you don't reveal confidential information. So for instance, you should promise not to reveal the name of the journal to which an article has been submitted. But the main thing of the pledge is whenever you review an article and the article is already available online, then the pledge is about the promise to publish your reviews. So we have quite a lot of people who have already signed the pledge. Here you see some names from people in the science studies or the Metascience community, but there are also people from all kinds of other communities that are supporting this. And if you want to support as well, then just go to our website, publishyourreviews.org, and you can very easily sign the pledge. And that's important, of course, because that's also a way to create more awareness by showing that there is a kind of an initial group of people that feel this is a good idea. That's a way then for us to also kind of convince other people to take this seriously. That's what this is all about. To conclude, I have questions for those of you who know much more than I do about this notion of decentralized science, this incentive thing. I think there are two big issues here. How to incentivize researchers to preprint their work, so not to wait until finally some journal has accepted their article for publication, but to already publish it on the preprint server. And second, how to incentivize researchers to publish their reviews. So basically, to do the thing that we are promoting in this initiative. And there's, of course, always, as always with these things, there's a small group of people that just feel this is important, that are dedicated, committed, and that just do it. And then there is a large group of people that kind of agree with the whole idea and are, in principle, willing to support it, but they need to be pushed a little bit to actually start doing it. And I would really value your advice on how that can be done, how these researchers can be pushed a little bit. That's it. Thank you for your attention, and of course, don't forget to publish your reviews. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ludo. I think this is great, and I also need to go and sign a pledge, by the way, take a proper look at the website. I still didn't have time, but I will. And maybe a good way to start answering your question and you know ask to the DeSci community and attendees is. For Jeffrey or Ricardo to actually explain how the peer review functionality, the Research Hub works. because it's actually a nice feature of the hub that I think, in my opinion, is really interesting, and it goes exactly in the direction that you mentioned, Ludo.
Yeah, so I think I can take this one. We have actually, revamped the version of our like peer review. So what we can do in ResearchHub is you can leave a comment under specific papers that have already, been uploaded. So that works only with papers that have already been published or preprints, for example. But let's say you have a paper that is already published or is a preprint. What you can do is you can leave a comment, a general comment under the paper, or you can choose the option of leaving a peer review. So that will be obviously transparent, all in the open. What you do is basically you assign a score, 0 to 5, and you break that down into the different sections that we have in a peer review. So for example, you can have how was the impact of the paper, and you can give a score to the specific impact. And how was the methodology, where the methods used by the authors are clear so that other people can actually, reproduce the studies. And then there's a section on the results. So where the results actually explained in a clear manner. Did the authors also reflect on potential drawbacks of their not really drawbacks, but let's say limitations of their research. And then you leave a general score. So this is what you can do on ResearchHub, and you can do that in the open, and you have it basically similar to a comment. But what you could also be able to do is through our bounty feature, be able to request a peer review. So let's say you have a preprint and you basically want to ask for suggestions from the scientific community. What you can do, you can go on ResearchHub, publish your preprint, and ask for a peer review from a member of our community. And you can do that using our token, kind of like rewarding the user that gave you a peer review on your, and give you some feedbacks and some suggestions on your paper directly on the platform. And this is basically the gist of it, of how it works. I don't know, maybe Jeff, if you want to expand on it, but I think that pretty much sums it up.
Yeah, I think that's generally it. I think also as giving a public peer review, we have a system of like kind of an upvote, downvote. So the community can see the open peer review, and then if it's a quality peer review, upvote. If it's not a quality peer review, downvote. And the person who uploaded the open peer review can receive rewards from ResearchHub, depending on kind of that ratio of upvotes to downvotes, on top of what the submitter of the preprint would be willing to offer them if they were seeking a a peer review from them by applying a bounty on that.
Sounds really cool. I should take a closer look at all of this, but indeed this seems kind of aligned with at least the vision of also the Publisher Reviews initiative. Can I ask, so what is your experience in kind of the actual uptake of these types of things by the community?
So the feature is actually just like rolled out. Actually, the bounty feature is like pretty much almost out right now. So we're waiting to gauge to see how kind of the community leverages it, and to leverage it outside of just simply maybe like asking for somebody to help them with doing statistical analysis. So it's outside of peer review, but peer review is also one of the things. So stay tuned, I guess.
Great. I think something that might be interesting is, I don't know, Fox, whether you know of other projects that are working in particular on peer review that might be also interesting. I think it's even later on, I think it will be interesting for Ludo to know, and I'll also take a look, because I don't know on the top of my head at the moment, but I'm pretty sure other people are also working on it in this side. And then maybe we could take a look at a question from Patrick in the Q&A, which I think is very interesting. I don't know, Ludo, if you have a chance to take a look at it directly, because Patrick mentions the 550 movement by James Headers that I've never heard before, I have to confess, but maybe you do. So this is essentially advocating for journals to pay a scientist $450 per peer review. And the question from Patrick is, what do you think of financializing peer reviews, and whether this will make the whole procedure more sustainable, or could introduce more perverse incentives?
Yes, so that's a great question. I must say I'm a bit skeptical. I'm not sure this is really a good idea. And partly that actually relates also to a broader concern that I have. I'm actually not sure if we need all the peer review that is currently being done. So I'm not sure actually if we need to review all the research articles that are being produced. I would like to question it, and perhaps we only need to do peer review, feedback, evaluation of those articles that really matter, which I'm afraid is just a small subset of everything that's being produced. So that might be a different way to deal with this issue of kind of how to make sure we have enough capacity in the system to do peer review. I must, however, also say that I'm, of course, a bit privileged. I have a kind of a permanent position at the university, a decent salary. So for me, it's easy to say, well, payment is not necessary. And I also, at the same time, I realize that does not necessarily apply for others. So that's why I feel a little bit also uneasy to be kind of really too skeptical about this idea.
Okay, but I also think personally that this is something that, again, that perhaps in DeSci it is already being experimented on, right? Because we indeed don't know about this potential downsides of financialization or positive effects. So in that respect, I think it might be really interesting to see some experimentation, see what happens when doing it.
Yeah, I don't see any other questions. So what I would do is I would really like to thank Ludo for coming here today. Really appreciated your talk. Really like what you're doing. So we'll maybe have more time to discuss. You could come to one of our community calls. We could do an AMA maybe, and we could, dive into even more questions, because I feel like the community might have even more questions. So we'll probably need more time. So that could be a good opportunity to kind of like answer all of those.
I would definitely love to do that, but thanks for having me today.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ludo.
It's a great idea. Thank you, Ludo. Thank you so much. I see you.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and introduce Andre. Andre Chagwedera is the co-founder and CEO of Fleming Protocol, which is a data economy DAO that empowers patients to collaborate with scientists and industry to create impactful biomedical innovation. So Fleming Protocol seeks to allow patients to hold full custody over their own health data, and then even capture value on that data that otherwise would have been monetized by other larger corporations that would have owned your health data. And so it's definitely a very noble mission. And it sounds like there's a lot of regulatory hoops to jump through. And so with that, Andre, I also want to say Andre has been kind of a pleasure to communicate with, has been very responsive and kind of very enthusiastic about DeSci in general. And so with that, please, Andre, take it away and tell us about how patients and citizen scientists can help drive biomedical innovation forward.
Yeah, thank you for that, Jeff. I appreciate the very kind introduction. Yeah, hi, everybody. So as you know, I'm one of the co-founders of Fleming Protocol, which is a data economy DAO where patients, scientists, and industry come together to create biomedical innovation. And basically, I'm here today to talk about patient DAOs and their role in driving biomedical research and translation going forward. And the reason why I believe that patients are the driving force is because ultimately they are the ones that are the most incentivized to cure disease, but also are increasingly over time the source of the most granular data, which will help drive biomedical research going forward. And when these two forces have been harnessed in a way which is productive and doing that alongside scientists, it's led to some substantial results. For example, the story of the open artificial pancreas system with the diabetes movement in the 2010s. In essence, this was a response to the industry when they weren't providing products that the patients wanted to help with them managing their blood glucose levels. But in response to this, in essence, there was a distributed group of patients, scientists, and hackers who came together to create this new open artificial pancreas system, which led to the improvements in the ability to manage blood glucose levels within range, and also improve the quality of life of patients. And then if you fast forward into now, you actually find that the big medical companies like Medtronic have actually copied this innovation and now profiting from that. But make no mistake, this came from the patients in the first instance. Another example of a patient movement was the AIDS movement in the 1980s. Another example of when patients led a movement in collaboration with scientists to find a cure for the AIDS disease, but also to get funding for early stage research and basic research to make that happen. And this is all done in the face of complacency of the government at the time, but also the FDA. And ultimately, this did lead to the treatments that the community needed. It's also the basis, the research that they did was also the basis of a lot of things that we use today. And if you look at the FDA and how they function, they've made some substantial changes on the back of this. So for example, they include patients on certain boards, and also they have now more faster tracks to approve drugs and research products. And finally, we have the story of Henrietta Lacks, who inadvertently led a lot of biomedical progress. So in essence, she had cervical cancer in the 1950s, and she had a biopsy taken by one of the scientists at Johns Hopkins. She died, but ultimately the biopsy had a lot of unique properties, and this sparked the curiosity of scientists around the world at the time, and therefore the data was shared amongst them. And several decades later, we can find that there's been hundreds of thousands of research papers which are published based on this information. We also find that pharma made a lot of money with products that were developed on the back of the information. And yeah, there was a lot of progress made, and obviously there are some ethical issues with the story, which can be discussed in a minute. But the point is, like, the patient level and granular data led to a lot of this progress in a lot of fields in biomedicine. So what are commonalities in these three examples? Well, the commonality is that when patient communities and their data combined with motivated scientists come together, that results in substantial progress. But some of the examples that I mentioned, that they haven't been perfect. So as I mentioned with the Henrietta Lacks story, in essence, her data was used without her family's consent. And obviously big pharma and a lot of scientists benefited from this massively, but there's a lot of ethical concerns there. And then if you look at the AIDS movement as well, there was some infighting amongst the movement at the time, where you had the more scientific and policy-minded fraction of the movement versus the more activist wing of the movement, which led to some conflict, which stifled the movement. But when you look at the Web3 infrastructure and the tools it provides, it can help us to mitigate some of those issues, but also enhance some of the strengths that we're seeing within these movements. So for example, the fact that we can have permissioned access to data, so you can aggregate your information and share it with whoever you please, and you can track that. And also the nature of DAOs and the fact that they're distributed, and you can have governance and reputation systems to help weed out some bad actors. And also the fact, because these DAO infrastructure systems are global systems now, so you'll be able to capture a lot more support from the global community, but also attract more funds to push the research and fund the research that the community needs. And early stage researchers have a huge incentive to reconsider how things have been done, because, as I'm sure a lot of you know, academia do make a lot of contributions in the kind of early and stage of research, but a lot of this research we find doesn't really translate to a real world outcome for patients. But then if you look at according to Angelo, the top selling drugs, the top 30, you find that 26 of those actually found their origins within academia. So whilst a lot of their basic research outputs don't translate to a real world outcome, when you look at the real world outcome, they are disproportionately coming from the early stage researchers. So there's a lot of value which is being created in the early stage of the research pipeline, but which isn't reaching. And imagine if we were able to double this effort, the impact it would have on curing disease and our general lives. And again, patient DAOs will be very well placed to help pull these discoveries out of the early stage research part of the pipeline, being able to potentially gain capital for that research, but also using some of the patient experience and data to help make early findings more translatable to a real world outcome. Pharma also has an incentive to change how things are done. So since the 1960s, the drug development pipeline has been on an exponential cost increase in terms of the cost of development. And this has been in the face of technological advances, and the failure rate of research efforts is still at around 90%. So overall, there's a huge incentive for early stage researchers as well as biotechs to make changes in the process. But ultimately, it's the patient who has the biggest incentive, because they bear the brunt of the failures that we've seen. So in terms of where we go from here, I think a very useful quote to frame this is a quote from Thomas Kuhn's book, where he says, "In both political and scientific development, the sense of malfunction that can lead to crisis is prerequisite for revolution." And obviously, DeSci is a revolution in itself, and that's been in the face of the malfunction that we've seen, as demonstrated in the previous slides. But in order to get the paradigm that we actually need to help this overcome those issues, I believe that it needs to be guided by the patient perspective and patient DAOs, because they are the ones who are the most incentivized to cure disease. And I think they'll be very well placed to help guide in collaboration the intellectual capability of the community, but also the capital that it has been able to raise. So in summary, why patient DAO is going to be the driver? Well, they're uniquely placed to build community data economies and obtain funds. They incentivize people towards a common goal, for example, curing disease. And finally, in general, decentralized systems will be able to handle complexity far better than centralized systems, because the world is a very complex place and biology is also very complex. So having a distributed network of experts working in real time will, in my opinion, far out compete the centralized systems working in isolation and silos. And here's one example of how a patient DAO could contribute to basic and preclinical research. So patients have a lot of information in terms of their experience. They can also express unmet needs, pose research questions, and also contribute data and analysis. And if you use this information, the scientists can then narrow their search in terms of literature reviews and also data analysis, and also pose some additional research questions based on the patient's data and feedback. And this will, if it works in the ideal case, would result in a research proposal and ideas which have been validated by a patient community. And this, by definition, makes that the likelihood of the research translating to the real world far more likely, because it's been validated by the real world experience of the end user. And if you look at the likes of some studies from, for example, Andrew Lowe, who talks about incorporating patient preferences via Bayesian decision analysis, so really trying to quantify the patient's willingness to accept risk and will it outweigh the benefit, for example. I think that can be used in a variety of ways to help quantify the patient's perspective and prioritize research and make it more translatable. And assuming that there are some very beneficial proposals and ideas which have been created as a result of that collaboration, patient DAOs are in a very good position to fund those proposals and ideas, and they can vote on that using a system like quadratic voting, for example, to make sure that the interests aren't too skewed in a particular direction. And the funding is one part, but we can also look at the delivery as well. So, for example, patient DAOs are, as I mentioned, like patients in general, but especially at a aggregated level, are increasingly becoming the source of useful information to drive translation and research. For example, their omics data, devices and apps, data, health records, patient biomaterials would come from them as well. And the scientists can use this information to help identify targets which are worthy of investigation, but also to validate compounds which will, based on that patient data, and again, to increase the likelihood of translating and having success in clinical trials. And also patient DAOs can play a huge role in the new world of decentralized clinical research trials, which have especially become more prevalent since the COVID-19 pandemic. So again, there's been a lot of information that can be collected at this point from the patients in terms of their data, their perspectives, etc. And scientists who are conducting the trials can use this information to design trials which are, more geared towards the patients and the desired outcomes. And with this information, we can also better recruit patients, because if you look at the information and data, we can make sure that the right patients are selected for particular trials. And DAOs, as I mentioned earlier, have incentive ways. If you have the token, you can incentivize people to take part in clinical trials. And we know that one of the issues in the real world at the moment with pharma, etc., is that they don't have a very good track record of keeping patients incentivized throughout the whole of the trial. And there's actually quite a high dropout rate in some instances, for example, in breast cancer. So yeah, I think the incentives will also help with success in this new field. But also, when it comes to conducting the clinical trials, we know that the use of real-world data is increasingly becoming more of a factor. If you look at the FDA, the EMA, and the MHRA in the UK, for example, they've all recently released guidance on using real-world data to help expedite and speed up clinical trials. And the source of a lot of this information comes from patients and their devices and whatnot. So these means can be used to help take part in clinical trials, and scientists can use that information to validate that data to hopefully have a valuable clinical research output. So in order to make this possible, we need to have composable DeSci communities and protocols to collaborate to make this a reality. So as I'm sure a lot of you are aware, there are a lot of DeSci protocols that focus on the early stage of discovery and the delivery of science, but also the funding of that science. But increasingly, we're finding that the patient element of this is becoming more prominent. So obviously, Fleming Protocol, my company, we're one of those patient DAOs. Bio, who recently announced their company, they're focused more on rare diseases. And increasingly over time, there'll be more of these patient DAOs to make this a more complete picture. And yeah, ultimately, we need to make sure this all works and functions together in the correct way so that we can disintermediate the current system, which isn't working for scientists or patients. And finally, I believe that the end goal should be to achieve almost like a patient network state where you have millions of patients who are collaborating alongside millions of scientists on the world's toughest issues when it comes to curing disease and scientific breakthroughs. And when we get to that state, we can have more capital and a bit more clout to take control of the whole research development pipeline and also have some regulator legitimacy. So bearing in mind the amount of capital which is flowing through the crypto space, the likelihood of that growing over the next few decades is quite high. And the likelihood with that would mean that we can be in a better position to fund the whole drug development pipeline. But there may still be quite a bit of time before we get there. We also need to, in this new system, harness distributed science tools and the idea of self-experimentation and doing so safely. So, for example, a somewhat controversial example would be the use of home CRISPR kits and allowing people to do experiments in their own homes. And granted that there are some potential risks there, but I think given if you have a system which has the right governance and obviously over time these technologies will develop to be a bit more safer, and yeah, having the right governance to help with and guide that effort would, I think, have potential implications, like beneficial implications for personalized medicine and other fields. And it's also worth noting that there has been several examples of Nobel Prizes being awarded for discoveries which were actually discovered initially from doing self-experimentation. So I think if we're able to distribute that in a way that's effective with new tools, then I think we'll make a lot of substantial progress in scientific discovery. And all of this needs to be underpinned by new models of intellectual property and discovery. So we know that, for example, Molecule are looking at IP NFTs, which I think is a good model potentially, and also crowdfunding cures who are looking at new ways to incentivize research efforts to translate to a real world patient outcome. So we need to kind of keep up that momentum with finding these new models to make sure that they gear towards more patient outcomes and improving those. So I'm going to finish this presentation with a quote from one of our collaborators who's a part of the diabetes community. His name is Ben West, and he's one of the founders of the Night Scout application. He says, "Let us consider how we can unify our demands for trustworthy, high-fidelity therapy that, adapting to our lifestyles, allows us to return to the lives we want to pursue with the people and activities we love. Let us make the benefits we discover accessible to as many as possible." And I think this is a very good way to end this presentation, and also a very good reminder as to why DeSci and patient DAOs need to exist and collaborate. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Andre. That was really wonderful. And yeah, maybe I can kick off like some of the question and answers. So I guess when it comes to patient data, one important thing, at least like in the current like universities and hospitals, is like HIPAA regulations. And so especially with researchers with patient data, you want to make sure to de-identify that patient's kind of name and information and things like that, and then kind of leverage the information that you might need. And then just kind of wondering on like the level of privacy, how some DeSci projects or Fleming is going to go about kind of maintaining that set of privacy, whether that's with something like zero knowledge proofs or like some other method.
Yeah, that's a very important point, because if you take the likes of GDPR, for example, where the producers of that data have the right to be forgotten. So a lot of the decentralized storage solutions wouldn't really account for that. But if you look at, for example, Ocean Protocol, and there's a new company called WeaveChain, they have a workaround on that, in the sense that they allow scientists to run computations on data which is stored locally on machine. So it's locally on the patient's device, for example, and the scientist can still get a meaningful output from that. And the patient still has the ability to be forgotten. So yeah, I think the computational computing, zero knowledge proofs will play a huge role in that. Because obviously a lot of this health data is very sensitive, and we need to maintain that to make patients more willing to share information for the benefit of research. And I think zero knowledge proofs and computational computing in general will play a big role in that, or a very essential role in that, actually.
Oh, okay, awesome. Yeah, thank you. I didn't know about that. Okay, so looking at the Q&A, I don't think there's any particular questions. One person commented saying there's a high risk of high bias data.
I guess it depends on the data you're talking about, because I guess if you want to talk about data that comes from Apple watches, for example, like heart rate and sleep, etc., if you were to account for that in research, obviously it's probably a fair assumption to say that people who are from affluent backgrounds are more likely to have an Apple Watch, and therefore the data that you're getting fed into this research will be skewed towards that, as opposed to people who are from more deprived backgrounds. But then if you look at diabetes, for example, where they have, a lot of the people have to monitor their blood glucose levels several times a day, and they have their own devices and apps like Tidepool, which can aggregate their information. And yeah, because that's almost essential for diabetes patients to do that, I think there'll be less of an issue, because if you have diabetes, you need to do it. And if you want to engage in this research, then you can. So the barrier of entry in that respect is not as high as opposed to with Apple Watches. I hope that answers that question.
Yeah, I think that was pretty reflective of what the question was. And then we just got a last minute one from Giovanni. He said, "Thank you for your presentation and project. It's very ambitious and exciting," which I definitely agree. I wonder how would you deal with patient compliance and monitoring during a trial via patient DAOs? Yeah, that's a very, very good question. And I'll be lying if I said that we had the solution for that, the perfect solution for that. But I know there are, in the traditional sense, they have these data committees which look at the integrity of data which is being pushed through the drug development pipeline, for example. So I can totally foresee that in the DAO governance, you can have a working group like that, which will be in charge of looking at data integrity and being incentivized to keep on top of that. There may be some other potential solutions around that. Like I know in the FDA guidance, for example, they talk about the risk of data integrity when doing things more remotely. So there will be some suggestions in there, but because decentralized trials are still a new phenomenon, there's definitely some work that needs to be done to make sure that the solutions are concrete. But I think having a dedicated group who is incentivized to look at data integrity and compliance, etc., I think is a good way to go in a Web3 context. But yeah, I'm sure there are some other solutions that can be considered, which I'm not aware of at this point in time. Okay, awesome. And then we got a last one again by Patrick. So maybe we can do a quick one here, and then I want to respect the time of the next one, the next speakers. But said, "Hey Andre, how much success have you all had trying to explain your tokenomics to patient communities? Have you found a simple, succinct way to get patients on board with Fleming's reward structure? I'm asking because DeFi tokenomics can be incredibly complicated, and it feels like this might be a barrier to adoption to patients who may not have the time or background to fully understand this mechanism." Yeah, again, a very good question. The way we've kind of been approaching it is not to be too heavy in the discussions of the tokenomics, and more starting from what the use cases could be and what it could mean for patient communities. And I think that's the best way to start. And then when there's the more kind of technically minded who want to dig in a bit more deeper into the detail. And if you take the diabetes community, there are plenty of those people, because they're quite technical and they've been kind of hacking devices for decades. So you do have those members of the community as well, and you can have the more technical conversation with them. But I think on a more broader scale, it's really about trying to start with the use case and what the implications could mean for curing disease and everything else that's more relevant to patients. I think if you can explain that in a good way, and then
frame how crypto can help with that after that without getting too technical. I think that's probably the best way to go, but also be ready for some of the communities who would want to know that detail, because they do exist as well. So it's a bit of a mixed approach in terms of how we go about that. It depends on who you're speaking to. But I think in general, definitely starting with the use case and speaking in simple terms is the best way.
Absolutely. I think abstracting away some of the crypto concepts is always kind of a win when it comes to a lot of like the scientific community. So yeah, with that, I want to say thank you so much, Andre. It was a real pleasure to have you here.
Perfect. So I'm really, really excited for our next session. And we have Dr. Seixas here, and I will briefly talk about his bio, and then we'll go straight into the questions. But first, how are you doing, Dr. Seixas?
I'm well. Thank you so much, Dr. Olaye. Pleasure seeing you, and thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Thank you for joining us. So Dr. Seixas is associate professor at the University of Miami Miller School of Medicine in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences. He's also the founding director of the Media and Innovation Lab and associate director of the Center for Translational Sleep and Cardiac Sciences. His work has been supported and funded by the NIH and the NSF, and he's in charge of a lot of different industry and foundation organizations. He's also been recognized as one of the top 100 inspiring Black scientists by Cell Press, and has over 175 high impact peer-reviewed publications, book chapters, articles, and presentations. He's also featured a lot on TV and other media outlets through CNN, CBS, NBC, and Associated Press. And we're so excited to have him here for our first SciCon conference.
I am excited. Thank you so much. Wow, the panel that you've had over the last few weeks, and particularly today, have been just tremendous. So I'm just really happy to be part of this. Thanks.
Absolutely. So we'll first start off with a few definitions to make sure that everyone really tries to understand exactly what we are going to be discussing today. And what we are discussing today is how do we have rigorous science through inclusivity, through decentralized trials. And so decentralized trials are defined, this was through also Cell Press, as studies executed through telemedicine and mobile and local healthcare providers, utilizing processes and technologies differing from traditional clinical trial models. And remote decentralized trials are defined as an operational strategy for technology-enhanced clinical trials that are most accessible to participants and patients by moving clinical trials activities to more local and home-based settings. So Dr. Seixas, you're one of the first principal investigators to launch decentralized trials with extramural funding through the NIH, utilizing a health equity lens, which right now we know is a big problem and issue in clinical trials in general, on how do we make them more equitable. Can you please share more about this, and also with your work of doing this with COVID-19?
Sure, thank you so much. So, to be quite honest, we've been practicing, decentralized trials before it became a thing, to be quite honest. But I'm happy that it has been codified and formalized, because I think with that framework, it will allow many others to really join in the cadre of folks doing this type of work. And essentially, the reason why we pursue this line of work, it really became an outgrowth of concerns expressed to us by patients, and what we have also observed. And what we wanted to do is that we wanted to tackle some of our more, kind of vexing issues that plague our inability to conduct successful research. First, access. We knew that we wanted to increase access to all, not just a select few of individuals who had the time and the resources to participate in trials. We also wanted to address the issue of privacy. Many people believe that if you are capturing their data, they don't know where it lives. And so we wanted to be able to ensure that there is transparency as to how their data are collected and where it's stored. But we also recognize that if we want to be able to reach many people across different sectors and different communities, across different socioeconomic status, we really needed to ensure that we needed to make our process more efficient. It needed to be more dynamic and comprehensive. And this would allow us to not just capture traditional markers and predictors and risk factors for disease, but also digital biomarkers, because that would allow us to fully capture what might be driving or engendering disease, poor health, and allow us to be able to better capture data in a very dynamic, real-time way to understand how we can actually make certain adjustments to improve overall health. And so in many ways, here's what we did in terms of our process. So typically what we do, almost as if we did this in a reverse engineer way. We wanted to ensure that first, we communicated with our community steering committee, or what others may call an advisory board. And this really consists of individuals from the community, because this will allow us to establish pain and opportunity points. Because if you don't have buy-in from the community, they don't want to be part of these studies. And these are the folks who serve as credible messengers in the community, to have them be interested in the type of work and to be interested in their own health, because essentially we want to make people know that these studies are really here to help them. And this allowed us to do human-centered testing of devices, allowed us to develop architectures that would balance privacy as well as being user-friendly. And then from there, we did several different tasks where before we roll out any kind of decentralized trial in our community, we ensure that we do a readiness needs assessment, a cost analysis, a technical infrastructure assessment, as well as looking at the level of adaptation and flexibility of our trial into other different settings. Because one of the things that many people are concerned about is the process systematized in a way that it can lead to reproducibility and replicability. And so if we are able to ensure that we look at, or we develop infrastructures or processes that allow us to be able to adapt and to be flexible across different contexts, that will allow us to ensure that we have a successful decentralized trial.
Absolutely. And one of the main factors of success in a decentralized trial is that we are able to get the proper results. And we're also able to get it in a way where we're getting the information from every single portion and participant from the trial. And so we're really excited that, the conference theme is the intersection between decentralized science and Metascience. So can you share like your thoughts briefly on how can we increase the quality of scientific research through decentralized trials?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. I mean, all your questions are great. I think here's how we have done this, and we've thought through this very deeply, but we're continuing to think through it. So what we have done is that when you look at the pillars of science, we try to look at what does a traditional method do and what does a decentralized trial do? Because in many ways, that's how we understand the meta-science, to think about the science of science or the research of research. And so what we've done is that we have highlighted about 7 different components or pillars of science. First is the researcher and the scientist. What is their role? I would suggest that the role of the researcher and the scientist in a traditional approach is that in many ways, researchers take on this deity where they superimpose their ideas in terms of how they develop research questions and hypothesis building and testing. What we've done instead, we have decentered that through a decentralized trial framework, where instead the researcher and scientist is someone who co-creates, and they tell the lived experience of the participant in a very phenomenological way. The second major component of the science of science is what's the role of the participant? In traditional approaches, they see the participant as a subject. And that has a lot of political and existential types of impact, subjecting them to something, not in many ways tapping into the agency of the participant. Instead, we have decentralized it in a way where we treat them as volunteers. And so with that, the third component, their data, it's not seen as a black box where it's owned by the researcher, which is how it's traditionally done, but instead, we have what we call more transparency, and the data are owned by the participant. Then the fourth component has to do with what is the value proposition? What's the value proposition of the research or the science? It's important for us to share this because oftentimes in a traditional approach, it's oftentimes what we say prescribed discovery of mechanisms, meaning we want to ensure that whatever we're studying will have a significant impact on a certain outcome. But oftentimes when you have null findings, when you don't find what you're looking for, does it mean that that was a futile exercise? No, instead, through a decentralized approach, that we see the value proposition as being exploratory. And that's how we're able to bring other participants, particularly historically, people who are historically not represented in research. And then the other component of science is what we call the business model. What is the business of science? What's the business of research? And traditionally, we see it as very corporate, especially in academic medicine, and it's a very centralized revenue where you have to receive extramural funding. That money primarily goes to the institution, primarily goes to the researcher, but instead what we've been able to do in a decentralized way is to create cooperatives. And we're not the only ones doing this, others have done this, where it is a cooperative, it's a co-ownership of the revenue and the business model. And so the last two components have to do with what's the apparatus of the science? How is it that you conduct the research? What tools do you use? And typically in traditional research, they usually use what we call a researcher-focused approach. You're only going to use the tools that are most rigorous and precise and accurate. And I'm not saying that's not important, but what we know is that oftentimes those procedures are very cumbersome and not patient-centered. And what we do instead when we build these decentralized trials is that they're more volunteer-focused, because it's important for us to strike a really nice balance between whether or not if our participants will not get so overwhelmed by the technical aspects of our decentralized trials and the tools in that. And last but not least, the approach. What type of approach are we using? And in traditional approaches, we use what we call the patient coming to us, right? And that's how traditional medicine is practiced, right? People come to physicians and providers to seek care, but instead we have flipped that, where we are going to the patient, where research is done on the terms of the participant, where we can find this common ground. And so there are certain things that in exercising this, we have to be aware of what are some potential barriers. One is, what's the regulatory system, the compliance system? This has been very difficult for us to roll out in a traditional academic medicine because, ethical review boards aren't necessarily wired, because in many ways they are governed by certain HIPAA laws, and that's important, but it's driven primarily based on the legal ramifications of pursuing science. Then also you have to be careful about the technological maturity of the communities that you're going to engage in. So what we do is that even if we're rolling out a digital decentralized trial, instead what we do is that we have a very robust educational process informing and increasing people how to use digital technologies. And then we want to ensure that the patient experience is accessible, feasible, and does not make them leave the experience as if they're just so overwhelmed or they're not intelligent. And so that's how we've been able to do this.
That is so exciting, especially how you broke down the various different components on how to actually build a decentralized trial. So just to kind of get a more of a helicopter view for the big question, which is also the title of this talk, is how do we make research more rigorous and inclusive through decentralized trials? So if you have like an advice for other principal investigators who might be wanting to do this, like based on your own experience, how do we first, make it rigorous, and how do we make it inclusive?
No, I think these are some tough and great questions.
Yeah.
so thank you. So I think for us, we look at rigor in two ways, and it's not different from how people traditionally look at rigor. Typically, people look at rigor as some form of systematic approach. And what I would, concede is that that's important, but I would suggest that it is quite narrow. Because when people talk about rigor, they think about setting up a system, procedures of recruitment and collecting data and processing data, collating data, analyzing data, and writing about the results, because they want to be able to increase the reproducibility and the replicability of it. Because of the type of work that I do, we know that replicability is not the holy grail, because everything differs based on context. And so for us, we believe that in order to be systematic, that we must also consider that the systematization needs to be inclusive. What do we mean by that? It means, therefore, are you reaching a wide cross-section of people? And are you doing that systematically in a way that would lead to authentic participation of all people of all walks of life to want to be part of a research study? And so because of, we recognize that those are two key areas in which we must understand the idea of rigor and being systematic, ensuring replicability and reproducibility, but also inclusive, because that takes into consideration context and how that impacts results and the whole research process. And we've created the precision and personalized population health framework. And we have reverse engineered the entire research process, ensuring that we utilize the JEDI framework: justice, equity, diversity, and inclusivity. And so what we do when we lay out the entire research process in terms of community engagement and recruitment and engagement and the whole study process and the dissemination of results and impact on policy, we are able to ensure that we can do rigorous science, inclusive, but ensure that the implementation and the delivery of these trials are such that is empowering, because sitting at the center of it is justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. And so those are some areas that, we would really encourage people to take into consideration. Our paper, really describes this on, precision and personalized population health framework as well. Sorry, I don't have enough time to describe it in detail.
No worries. So we encourage everyone to check out that paper, as well as a really, great article. And what is really interesting, I think, is that a lot of people who are now currently building in the space is that some people are currently building for our current foundation of what's happening right now, but people are also thinking about how can we utilize these concepts to help, for a better future. So just for one last question is, personally, Dr. Seixas, what are your hopes and futures? And what is your hope for the future of decentralized trials based on what you're currently doing? And what is something that we can be doing better at to prepare for the future?
Well, I think having more conversations like this, and I applaud ResearchHub for doing this, and your colleagues as well for bringing and convening a very diverse group of individuals thinking through this, because the more we can create an ecosystem to do this, the better. The more our tools, the more our processes will be more refined and will be more suited for all. I think fundamentally what I foresee and I hope is that we must also decentralize trials. And here's why it's important. And the reason why I think it's important is because we must also recognize that there is hegemony really sitting at the center of a decentralized trial as well. And some of you might say, whoa, I thought we were the ones who were, kind of deconstructing the hegemony in traditional research. But here, let me explain why this is important. And it's not a bad thing, because any framework has assumptions. So, traditional research trial has its assumptions, and decentralized trials has its own assumptions as well. So here they are. There's an assumption that there is high device tech literacy. We have found that not to be true. And even in instances where we enter into certain spaces where we assume that these communities do not have a phone or a mobile phone or don't, that we actually have had to suspend those. So be careful that you want to ensure that you suspend some of your assumptions, while at the same time balancing that we can't be shoving things on people's throats. So that's one assumption that we must be aware of, especially in decentralized trials. And the other assumption is that we believe that people ought to care about our digital technologies and trials because it's cool. That there are some people for whom, like Miss Jones or Mr. Hernandez, who has type 2 diabetes, who's working 2 jobs, or who is a day laborer, that the cool factor is not sufficient for them to participate in a clinical trial. And so we have to be mindful of that. And also what we need to be aware of is that we don't necessarily need to read into this idea of addressing, technical barriers. We want to acknowledge technical barriers, but at the same time, we must also find ways in which we can improve it. Because what's happening, unfortunately, is that we might be exacerbating what we all know about this digital divide. And so for me, in terms of a wish list, my hope is that academic medical institutions establish better partnerships with companies, tech companies, founders, startups, to lead in this space, because I truly believe that decentralized trials should not just be monopolized by pharmaceutical companies because of the fact that they have found that more traditional approaches of trials have not worked in increasing the diversity in their subject pool, but instead see it as an opportunity to really bring people into the planning process of creating research projects. I also wish that there is more of a regulatory body where we can look at not just traditional research, but also decentralized trials, even if it's on federated approaches or on the blockchain of some sort, that we need some kind of regulatory body to ensure that the decentralized folks don't become the new center, right? Which will really be promoting and promulgate, health disparities. I think we need an honest broker. So any study that you are creating, ensure that you have an honest broker, either a steering committee, advisory board, or whomever, and they have to be representative, or somewhat of a czar, so to speak. And we have prided ourselves at the Media and Innovation Lab to serve as such, that when companies come to us, that we said, is your solution population health relevant and ready? And so that's what my wish list is. I'm sure I would love to hear others as well. I'd love to hear yours, Dr. Olaye.
Absolutely. And so I will save my answer on what my wish list is, because I know that many people in the audience have questions, and
Sure.
in a decentralized approach, I don't want to do the one asking other questions. So I'll take an audience question. So we do have one question from Patrick Joyce. He really enjoyed your talk, and he said that he saw a few groups recently involving patients in the actual study design and the methodology of decentralized research studies. So his question is, do you think it is important or valuable from a scientific perspective to empower patients to have a more active role in designing the decentralized clinical trial that they eventually participate in?
I agree. And I kind of said this a bit flippantly in the beginning. I think we've been doing this work before it became a thing. And that's what we would do. We have a steering committee. So here's what we do. So before we submit any grant, that we have community buy-in. Seriously, in terms of the hypothesis design, the focus, what the procedures are. I mean, we have had situations where we have had to change the surveys that we used in our grant because our steering committee said to us, it's too long. We understand it's seemingly more rigorous, but no one is going to do that. And it has forced us. And so in one instance, we were able to cut our survey, the time it would take for a participant to fill out our surveys from about 60 minutes to about 35 minutes. That's meaningful, because if someone is moving from one place to the next, or they have to, in between jobs, and you're getting them on the phone, you're like, I need you to answer these questions. And that's tough. That's a hard sell for them. And I truly believe that, oftentimes researchers believe that if they invite people as part of the research process, especially in drafting what the focus needs to be, that they're going to lose control. And that is so far from the truth. Why? Because many of us who do digital technologies, who use human-centered design, methods of developing apps or digital solutions, know that it is the most enriching and informative element of the development process. And research is no different from that. And so I would encourage everyone to get a steering committee, a group of individuals who are credible messengers in the community, different walks of life, we have, pastors and, faith-based barbershop, beauty salons and all. So that's what I would encourage them to do.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Seixas, for this wonderful talk. For more information on Dr. Seixas, please head to the ResearchHub website where you can get all of his information. You can follow him on social media and also on Google Scholar to see exactly a lot of the work that is coming out of his lab. But thank you again for joining us this Saturday and talking to us about decentralized clinical trials. I mean, it's so exciting.
Thank you so much. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you. Perfect. So for our last talk for this wonderful day of panels, we will be speaking about a Metascience approach to commercializing and building products in decentralized ecosystems. And so I will now bring Iyore to be a panelist. So first we'll start off with a brief bio about Iyore. Named to Forbes magazine 30 under 30 list for her profound work at the age of 22, Iyore Olaye is an award-winning engineer, turned technology executive, investor, and world-renowned speaker. Olaye is at the forefront of innovation and intersecting the digital and physical worlds. Olaye is a co-founder and managing partner of CoveredBy Group, a technology advisory and investment audio firm. And also, in addition, Olaye is the managing partner of SFF, a pre-seed investment fund by Sousa Ventures. So we're so excited to have Iyore here today. How's it going?
Hi, everyone. It's going very well. I'm very excited to be talking about this topic, especially through this lens. So super excited to dig right in. And thank you for the wonderful introduction.
Perfect. So for our first question that we have here is, so you have experience building products and serving as an executive at technology companies, intersecting the digital and physical worlds in various industries such as smart cities, transportation, sustainability, health and wellness, and now even Web3. So what exactly are the challenges and what is exciting about building products in this new decentralized ecosystem?
Yeah, absolutely. So as I mentioned, or as you mentioned, I have had deep experience building and launching and scaling companies, whether it be through mergers and acquisitions and through IPOs. And I found that some of the best solutions happen when innovation and incentives are directly aligned. And typically that is through the lens of investors and technology executives or early stage teams thinking through what that alignment means. And then oftentimes that trickles down internally to other individuals who are building within. And what I love about the decentralized ecosystems that we're now engaging in is that everyone can feel a part of that process. They understand how they're collaborating and contributing, and you're able to really understand how incentives are defined, set, and what that means for your work, but also the success of the project. And then also, if we're thinking from a business sense, oftentimes when we see research and development, technically there are research teams who are hyper-focused on a solution, and they're not always thinking through commercialization at that point. And when they get to a point where there is a breakthrough or an insight, there are many different ways that you can start to define what return on investment is, what does commercialization actually look like, what does that actually mean for customers? And that's a really exciting perspective, but it also takes a lot of time. And oftentimes what that means is that you end up having teams that start to hyper focus on an arm of their opportunity or the problem that they're trying to solve in order to really start to define what profitability looks like. And they end up building a really siloed solution that oftentimes doesn't necessarily tackle the entire scope of the challenge. So when you think about the digital and physical world, there's tons of different sectors that require an extensive amount of time. And so the reality that in this decentralized world, you can have many different individuals who have extensive knowledge on a topic, but separate focus coming together in order to create a collaborative solution that can actually be something that's commercializable.
That's great, especially, what's happening is that things and products are being built so fast in this new environment. And so many communities are now, quote unquote, DAOs, are in this new decentralized ecosystems are now taking the next step to figure out exactly if their community is fundable as a business, and if they create a product, can that be commercialized? So I'd love to kind of hear your thoughts about that and what's happening in the space.
Absolutely. And that's part of the reason why I loved our topic so much, and thinking about it through the lens of a meta-science approach. And so the question that I would ask any individual who is a part of a decentralized group, whether it's formally a DAO or a group of individuals coming together to focus on a problem, is, have they built before? Have they studied the processes and procedures of taking an idea from incubation through research, through development, through consumer testing, and thinking and asking the basic question, will someone pay for this solution, right? If you're thinking about a DAO that might be coming together for a solution that they ultimately want to see some type of return on investment for. But what we're also seeing are tons of communities coming together around a problem that they want to solve. And the really interesting aspect here, and one thing that I would just encourage everyone to think through, is if the group together has thought through the process and procedure of building out these products, have they failed? Have they been successful? And are those learnings complementary in a really interesting way? And the reality is that oftentimes we know that when a problem that ends up turning into a solution is identified, it is something that the founder themselves has a unique experience with. The fun thing about decentralized ecosystems is that many different individuals might have a unique insight or unique experience that may transition into more specificity for a specific solution. And so one thing that I would caution anyone potentially involved in or participating in an ecosystem is not searching to solve a problem just to solve a problem, but really making sure that the problem that they're trying to solve and the solution that they come up with is something that their sector actually needs and that customers will actually be willing to pay for. So that's kind of what I would say there. Very exciting times to really kind of get many different learned experiences in one single center. But then also I would caution that you aren't just looking to solve a problem for problem's sake, that you understand exactly the problem that you're trying to solve, why it's important, and can build collaboratively quickly to get that to market.
Really interesting. So I know that in addition to you building products, you also are an investor. And so this is a really, new, exciting space, but not traditionally a space where you see a lot of external funding or even venture funding. So do you have any advice for investors, either angel investors or traditional investors that are watching this, who want to do due diligence in this space, invest in this space, and from the lens of that, through the commercialization of products?
Absolutely. And this is very complementary to kind of what I was discussing previously. As an investor, you're, especially at the early stage, hyper-focused on the team. And the really cool thing about decentralized ecosystems is that that team can be quite large. However, the question that you'd want to ask is there a single heartbeat that is making a group or ecosystem thrive and ideate and deliver? Or are there multiple heartbeats that are focused on a sector of that group or ecosystem? And are they kind of sharing that load of creating a vision and setting the eyes and the sights of other collaborators on that? The reality is that is the risk with a decentralized ecosystem. If you have a single individual, if that person becomes less engaged or shifts gears, how does that impact the ecosystem and what is that transitional moment? But when you think about looking and examining the opportunities to invest into decentralized ecosystems, thinking through if there's many different nodes, that if one node were to shut down or to underperform, can the other node support it? And if that answer is yes, then that's something that should be considered when thinking through whether or not this investment is both reliable, but also sustainable for the long term. But additionally, I typically use a ROSE framework. So team and timing, something that we just thought about. Team being, can it sustain itself? But then also timing, can the team in a decentralized manner really ideate quickly and scale? We talked about that a little bit earlier. And then operations, so the O in ROSE, thinking through, can they be efficient with how they spend time. And so I believe when I was tuning in earlier, there was a discussion around whether what decisions should be made collectively and what decisions should be made independently, and thinking through whether or not the ecosystem has the decision-making protocols that are in place and tried and true. So you want to actually see an example of this at work is very important. Next letter being S, so speed. Again, innovate, iterate, innovate, iterate. That's the way that we do it when you think about a traditional structured company. But now in this decentralized world where there are so many different contributors who have varying degrees of involvement and contributions, can you kind of get into that groove in a way that makes sense? And then finally, establish or dominate and grow. And so what we've actually seen is that there's many decentralized ecosystems that have popped up, and some of them are actually working in many different sectors. And some sectors are the same and they're doing complementary work. And so the reality is that the decentralized systems that we have in place allows for groups that have come together to collaborate in a way that's a bit easier than we've typically seen in the non-decentralized space. But we still want to be able to see if there can be someone who can be dominant in the space that they're operating in and the problem that they're trying to solve. And can they use relationships with other organizations to grow and sustain that growth and be better for their customers? And so hyper focusing on that row, so ready, team and timing, operations, efficiency, ROI, speed, innovation and iterations, and then E, can they establish themselves, dominate and grow? And a lot of those answers oftentimes rely on having reliable data. So making sure that you have that in place and are adjusting your due diligence process to really kind of vet the needs or the unique challenges of decentralized organizations.
So interesting. And thank you for sharing about that ROSE framework. I think it really helps people understand exactly how to understand what's happening like in this space, especially with the building of products. So now as we're coming, to the closing of your talk, I always like to end a lot of these different panels and talks with a question about how do we utilize decentralized ecosystems to try to help us exactly understand what's happening now and to make improvements for the future. So Iyore, what are your hopes for the future of building products in decentralized environments and ecosystems?
Absolutely. So my hope is centered on the concept of collaborative impact, the ability for many individuals with different expertise to come together to build better solutions. What you oftentimes see right now is that individuals who are operating in a decentralized ecosystem and knowingly doing so are technical or have some type of affinity towards tech first things. And so what you see is that there are tons of engineers and scientists coming together to solve problems. But as I mentioned earlier, we have to make sure that the incentives are aligned so that customers and potential investors and potential like corporations that might leverage these solutions understand some of the impacts and the opportunity at hand. And so right now, I don't think that we're seeing that in its fullest potential. But I believe that the future lies where you'll see different individuals, whether they're engineers and researchers or executives or investors or family offices, all coming together in a really interesting way on a particular focus or topic to solve a solution, create a product, and to scale it. So that's the future. We're seeing it work very well for the technical community. And I'm excited to see, different groups coming in. Our lawyer friends have dove in into DAOs very deeply. So we're seeing that presence. And I think that it'll definitely start to grow outwardly a lot more and be very exciting and something that others want to participate in. Which is extremely important. And then also, what's really exciting is that in this realm, we can start to ask the question, like, can doing good ultimately be profitable? And so when we think about solutions that oftentimes fall in the impact sector, whether it's healthcare solutions, climate solutions, things that concern education and the future of cities, sometimes working on those things, even at the earliest stage, doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be profitable in the same way a normal B2B SaaS company would be, or that there's funding in the same way, or that people feel outside of the tech community that there should be some type of incentive. But now that we have the framework to think through how doing good can also be good for the world, but also good for a single individual, we're definitely opening the door for there to be solutions that actually start to solve some of these very, very complex problems. And then finally, because of the tokenomic kind of frameworks that we're seeing, even in like the DeSci space, it opens the door to kind of even use that as a framework to ensure that doing good means that all collaborators that are involved can feel that they incentively see a return on investment for not only their moral participation, but also their day in, day out participation.
Amazing. So I'm going to look into the chat to see if we have any questions. This has been so interesting so far. So let me see. Yes, we do have one. Yes, we have a question from Patrick Joyce. And so he said amazing talk and is really excited about this topic. So he said that he is curious about how you think about value capture for a DeSci token, and have there been any tokenomic models in the DeSci space that you're particularly excited about, especially because we know that in Web 1.0 and 2.0, there were different companies like Kickstarter where organizations were able to crowdsource money in order to either build their MVP or to build products. So you had that sort of like crowdsourcing it. And now we're also seeing now in the DeSci space where individuals now as members of communities through tokenomics are either giving tokens or paying for tokens, to be able to either pay as a vote to which projects are going to end up being funding, or to support a community either through their quote unquote pre-seed or seed funding to build those products. So what are your thoughts exactly about the value capture for our DeSci tokens and how that can be utilized for commercializing products?
Very interesting. So I think through a couple of things. So I think that the tokenomic infrastructure that we're seeing, and it allows both early contributors to really feel like they have a value or ownership stake within a specific entity. And then it allows individuals who don't necessarily have maybe the expertise in a sector to still be able to buy into the future early. And so it's really interesting because you see definitely this really kind of symbiotic relationship between equity that is earned with time, with work, and with interest. And then you also see kind of like this retail investing perspective and lens where someone who's very interested in something early can kind of still see those responses and those returns just because they're an early supporter. And so that's why when we think about what that actually means and unlocks for projects from both an investment side and a commercialization side is huge. From an investment side, oftentimes, as I mentioned earlier, when we think about research and development, there really isn't a solution yet that someone can look at a metric and say, this thing is performing well or not. But now that we have tokenomic models, you can actually use that to derive a metric for the community. And that in itself will allow individuals to be able to evaluate the health of a community that might be doing more research-oriented things that isn't shipping solutions yet. And so what that means is that that's a language that organizations can use to talk and collaborate with investors in very interesting ways. And then from a product commercialization standpoint, we have seen when people have ownership in something, they feel more inclined to make it succeed. Usually that ownership is achieved with customer interviews. There's a customer who's using it very early on. They feel like because they get to get features first, they're oftentimes giving feedback. But when you're building solutions, there's only so many features that you can ship, and sometimes that enthusiasm can wane. So with these structures in place, you can have people who own or hold a token feeling the excitement or kind of that they have something that makes them a part of it. And you'll be able to get a lot of those customer feedback conversations happening without thinking through maybe alternative incentive models that oftentimes we have to think about when we're not operating in a decentralized space. And then finally, when we think about kind of the question, how will challenges be addressed over time with products and solutions? The voting ecosystem is very important. Tons of technical individuals who collaborate with executives on the day in, day out. A lot of my teams and organizations that I'm working with are oftentimes frustrated because they don't feel like that marketing understands them, or they don't feel like that the business really is understanding the power and the prowess of the technology that's being built. When you have these voting structures, you have individuals who oftentimes feel like that their voice is not heard, or their direct kind of words are being lost in a game of telephone. That starts to be eliminated because these voting structures provide a place where you can speak and feel like you have actual, like you are a true stakeholder in what happens with the solution and how it evolves over time. And sure, you definitely have that when you reach a certain like leadership perspective in a normally kind of centralized company structure. But oftentimes in these innovation environments, it gets lost when people are trying to market it and scale very quickly. And the tokenomic models that are specifically being built, and I'm seeing leveraged very well in the DeSci space, will open the door for that, specifically when organizations get to the point where they commercialize their research.
So those were all the questions that we had. This was definitely amazing talk and a great way to end our first day of Plenary summits and talks. And so this was an amazing. So thank you so much, Iyore, for your time.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, thank you, Rick. Thank you. I mean, we really had some amazing talks, amazing speakers today. Really excited and looking forward to tomorrow's day, because we're gonna have so many more speakers, and today has been really good. A lot of like really cool discussions. So again, really looking forward to tomorrow. Just a couple quick information for tomorrow. We're closing the session here today, and tomorrow we'll be restarting at 12:30 p.m. EST. We'll do a quick intro. It's probably gonna be me and Patrick doing a quick intro, like a 10 minutes, introducing the speakers for the day. And then we're gonna replay the Meet the Founders talk that we had with Brian on Wednesday. So if you missed that, make sure you don't miss this this replay that will go live on again 12:30 tomorrow, 12:30 p.m. East Coast time. And then I would say there's so much excitement, I would say, for tomorrow. And I would just say I'll see you all tomorrow. And if you have any questions, again, we're here to hear them. So feel free to reach out if you have any other questions about or any feedback from today's talks. So thank you all again.
And also, if you had a great time, learning about a lot of these new DeSci concepts, please share your enthusiasm on social media. Please tag us on the ResearchHub Twitter, also on LinkedIn, social media, various different platforms. And please share with your friends. They're still able to register to attend. We have a very great jam-packed schedule for tomorrow, same time, same place. And also, feel free to join our Discord, is where our community lives. The link is actually on our website, so you can come and we can all chat about all the great things that we learned and continue this conversation outside of Zoom on Discord.